I was one of many slaves, written by Bea Eschen. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This material is protected by copyright. Just before sunrise, we were awoken by the crack of his whip. The weapon was made of leather, attached to a stick that branched into 7 tails of 6 knots each. When used correctly, it tore up the victim's skin and caused severe pain that left the victim writhing. It was my master's pride and joy, and he often used it to demonstrate his strength. He was an old and bitter man. Just the gaze of his eyes, which expressed nothing but coldness, taught you fear. He was tall and had no hair left on his ugly, egg-shaped skull, which was covered with a thin, oiled layer of freckled skin, translucent in places where you could imagine the small brain underneath. But the worst part of him was his large, bony hands with which he executed his violent blows. Hundreds of us crouched on the stone floor in one of the many side chambers of the temple as we awoke from a short and restless sleep. We yawned and stretched our worn bones and tired muscles. Years of physical and mental servitude manifested itself in our daily waking state, the constant lack of sleep and no time and opportunity for personal care. In the public toilet, we crowded around a hole so that we could relieve ourselves. I was of dainty physique and jumped the queue for which I was hated. Next, we lined up for our early morning meal and got bread, fish, beans, onions, and garlic with a sweet soup beer as a drink. All this was everyday life for us. We were slaves and grateful for what kept us alive, for we knew no other existence. We worshipped our queen, virtually a goddess, and loved to serve her. Therefore, it was a pleasure to go into the bushes at dawn and collect the dewdrops from the leaves of the trees. Only the most talented slaves were chosen for this delicate task, which made me feel special. I always went to the same tree. Its large, fan-shaped leaves, which reached my height, attracted me. They were unusual because they had no center vein. Instead, our god of trees had split them halfway down from the middle at the top. This made it easier to gently fold the 2 halves together and pour the precious morning dew into my little silver cup. The cup was my wealth and the only thing I possessed. My father had given it to me when he was dying. With his last breath he had asked me to take good care of it, because it was very valuable. I did as I was told. Every day I polished it feverishly so that it would shine like a mirror. When it was full, I liked to look through the crystal-clear water to the bottom. The tiny vibrations of my cautious steps reflected on the surface of the water and made the bottom of my sparkling vessel glitter in the early morning sun. I was very careful not to spill the water. It had become sacred for me, as I knew that my venerable queen would eventually immerse her body in it. My fellow slaves and I poured the contents of our cups into a beautifully decorated jug. Then, all the jugs of the morning collection were emptied into a golden bathtub for the queen. After the holy bath water had been warmed up and herbs and fragrant oils were added, our queen dipped her divine body into what I had helped to collect. While our queen spent the most blessed moments in the holy waters of the morning dew, she was washed with sweet-scented soaps and gently massaged by her female servants. These young women, barely in puberty, were chosen for their incredible beauty and bred and taught exclusively for the purpose of serving our queen. They were of excellent heritage. Only the healthiest and noblest men and women were paired to be the queen's personal servants. One of these girls was Anexi. When I saw her for the first time, my heart opened like a bud, which blossomed with the gentle touch of the sun and the breath of the wind. A wave of warmth, of incredible energy flowed gently through my veins. It felt as if I had slept all my life and woke up to the tingling feeling of an emerging love I had never felt before. For a fleeting moment she looked up, and her sparkling eyes, full of care and compassion, met mine. Immediately I was put into a heavenly trance. I was not far away from her, which gave me the opportunity to look at her tender body. Her hands were slender, with long fingers that merged into carefully groomed nails. She moved her hands tenderly, each stroke moving around our queen's tired leg muscles. Her elastic fingers moved slowly upwards in constantly repeating circles. Anexi's concentration now belonged solely to the task of making our queen happy in an exquisite way. Another servant, equally enchanting, but not as graceful in her movements, stood at the head end of our revered queen and moved her hands massaging downwards along the strong royal spine. In anticipation of what was to come, our queen breathed an almost inaudible sigh. As the two servants continued to slide their hands together and reached the royal buttocks, they gently pulled apart the voluminous cheeks, and with their caressing movements now in perfect harmony, they gave our queen sexual satisfaction. The moment Anexi reached into the sacred depth of our queen's body, she looked up at me, and our eyes merged like the smooth waves of the moonlit great water. Anexi's body reminded me of that of a wonderful dancer. The elegant gliding of a snake was an inviting but understated description of her delightful movements, while her gaze begged me for something so seductive I could hardly comprehend. In this divine moment, I forgot everything that was happening around me. I forgot what had happened before and what could happen later. Although I had always lived my life in devotion and sacrifice, at that moment I could not control my desire for Anexi. Suddenly I became aware of my phallus, which had hardened in the meantime and had outgrown the limits of my loincloth, with his head piercing curiously upwards. My petite body was reflected in my manhood, and those who thought that tall men with large phalli, whether slave or king, enjoyed more sexual appetite, were mistaken. A small drop of my precious seed formed at the top of my small but fully erect phallus, and since I was still lost in Anexi's flickering flames of desire, I did not notice my master approaching and drawing the whip. The sound of it immediately reduced my phallus to a tiny bulge that had no purpose other than urinating. As the seepage ran down the inside of my legs and a puddle spread under me, I suddenly realized that I had betrayed my queen. Male slaves were forbidden to show sexual desires for servants, and since the queen's personal servants belonged to a particular race, they had to be treated with the utmost respect. Any kind of affection shown for them showed particularly bad behavior and was punished with severe consequences. When I turned to my master, I looked straight into his frightening eyes and waited for the devastating blow which might even have had the power to kill me. After a brief period of surrender and in anticipation of what was to come, I was astonished to notice my master's hesitation. He suddenly realized that the queen was having the most captivating time of her otherwise uneventful life. At this time, Anexi's beautiful, slender fingers reached deep into our queen's sacred genitals, while the other servant gently kneaded around her vaginal lips. The harmony of movement between the two young women seemed to be the result of years of explicitly creative teamwork. Each knew the exact places they had to caress to make our queen squeal with boundless excitement. When our revered queen was overcome by orgasmic intensity, we all stood still and let this moment of complete joy break upon us as we thanked the universe of gods, souls, and spirits for the unique opportunity to be present in this blissful moment. When it was over, I was catapulted back to reality. My master grabbed me hard by the arm and dragged me away. His rough grip caused me enormous pain, but I was grateful that my whip treatment was delayed until we were away from Anexi. I would not have wanted her to see me suffer in an unbearable way. I held the brief moment of our merging eyes in my mind as if it was a special blessing from the universe to help me survive my punishment, and that this precious memory could even keep me alive. To my astonishment, my master gave me to one of his helpers, who looked as if he had just returned from the dead. The dark rings around his eyes covered over half his face, which was as white as that of a man who hadn't seen sunlight for decades. With rigid movements, like those of a living corpse, he led me a long way through dark alleys, heavy wooden doors secured by chains, and caves until we reached the main dungeon. The air was getting colder and colder, and the humidity was condensing on the rough rock faces and my smooth skin. There was no sign of life down there, except for a few piercing roots trying to escape the weight of the earth and their final strangulation. The ruthless earthly environment made me tremble with cold and fear. I felt a numbing load on me and tasted the rotting smell of cadavers. My tormentor led me into a free corner and placed a heavy iron clamp on my left foot, which he attached to a chain fitted to a rock. I wasn't alone. Others of my kind were also attached to the walls, and when the heavy door behind the jailer closed, with a loud bang, only the silence of a grave remained. Nobody moved or spoke. What remained was the devastating presence of death and decay, crawling insects and wriggling worms. After a while, I heard the weak voices of fearsome spirits call my name. "Let us welcome you in the Valley of the Souls." In my mind, I saw bloody, torn hands waving at me. My blood froze at the thought of being caught by them and drawn into the darkness. My heart pounded so strongly that my breath almost stopped. Gravity pulled me further into the depths, and the spirits of the fire made the flames of the earth flicker up to me. I flinched from the flames as far as the iron chain allowed. To be burned was the worst thing that could happen to me, for that would make life after death impossible. My soul was bound to my body, and it was receptive to perceptions after death. Signals given by my corpse were to be deeply engraved in my soul. At their rebirth, these signals should be present and contribute to the spiritual and physical life of the future. My soul was eternal. It was to return constantly. Not only my descendants, but all my people should benefit from my soul. But because I was only a slave, I saw no chance to have my corpse embalmed. So my dead body should be there at least temporarily to shape my soul. Shaken by fever and immersed in an ocean of spirituality, I saw in the distance the tomb god Anubis, with the head of a jackal shrouded in fog. He reached out to me to lead my newly deceased soul from the earth to the hereafter. I had to escape the flames to receive Anubis who would save my soul. Despite all this, I did not lose sight of a sparkling star, for with every breath I saw my gaze merge with Anexes. I saw her beautiful hands caressing the full body of our venerable queen, saw her supple self fluttering like a vibrant butterfly around our queen. I imagined us riding on a white swan that brought us to the other side of the great water, into a garden full of lush bushes and singing birds. I saw us lying on a soft, white cloud floating in the crystal blue sky beyond the horizon of our eternal love. We sat on the rainbow and counted the colors, while the rain beneath us watered the trees from which we picked sweet, juicy fruits. The spiritual divine elevation transformed us into beings free of good and evil, floating into the light of infinity. It was these vivid images that kept me alive during my time in the utterly discouraging dark hole. Many of my fellow prisoners died of despair and illness, while I upheld my body and soul under the worst conditions. One day I heard the heavy footsteps of my master as he approached the gate of the dungeon. It took an eternity for him to find me among the decaying bodies of my fellow prisoners. After he had checked that I was still alive, he mumbled something that sounded like a relief that I received with pure surprise. I was hardly conscious at that time, but still knew what was going on around me. It felt as if I was stepping out of a cruel animal trap as my master removed the iron clamp and heavy chain from my foot. In a magical moment that I will never forget, I rose from my misery to become human again. My weakness made me stumble and fall several times on my way out. When we reached daylight, my eyes were struck by the glare of the light like two colliding rocks. My master gave me a blindfold, which was partially torn, but which I immediately put on for fear of going blind. I was amazed that he cared for me. He led me across the marketplace through a crowd of curious gawkers. They stared at me in disbelief, probably because I was still alive and even walking, albeit on very shaky legs. Whispered shreds of excited talk penetrated my ears as my master dragged me through the crowd behind him. These people were made up of the citizens of our society who kept the economy running, farmers and merchants, builders, stonemasons and craftsmen, weavers and fishermen. Women who made beer, bread, sandals, and jewelry interrupted their work to gather in small groups and curse my shameful appearance. Soldiers and architects, artists, doctors and scribes stood away from the citizens of the lower classes, but were amused just as much about how the walking skeleton of a slave was dragged along by his master. However, my master remained unimpressed by his surroundings and took me directly to the sick chamber, where I was to spend weeks to recover from my ordeal. It didn't take long for my body to fight the fever that had tried to drag me away in the dungeon. Then I noticed that the doctors and carewomen were excessively worried about me. I was only a slave, and had never before in my life received attention for my well-being. To top it all off, a few days after my arrival, 4 slaves arrived with a knotted stretcher on which they carefully laid me. Before we left, I was washed and put into clean clothes from top to bottom. Never before had I worn a cape, and the heavy linen felt foreign to my body. Nevertheless, I was impressed to get such clothing that was actually only worn by the higher members of our society. I was so disoriented and confused that I did not recognize the way to my tree, the tree from which I had collected the morning dew for our queen before this deeply felt and life-changing event with Anexi. The way to the tree was taxing on my aching body, as my carriers had to climb over rocks and avoid obstacles. When they stopped just before the tree, they waited for my reaction, which slowly developed within me. My tree withered. It died! The large hanging leaves had brown, scaly edges. The once lush green had turned pale yellow. The shine had dulled, and the fruit had rotted. There were neither singing birds nor humming insects, and the aromatic smell around the tree had given way to that of rotten fruits and crawling worms. My lower jaw sank and tears ran down my face. What had they done to my tree? I stretched out my arms to our sun god and the spirits of the dead and living, and with a loud, broken voice I shouted into the universe, "Why?" My cry hit the walls of the buildings in the immediate vicinity, and the echo returned several times, adding an extra dimension of dramatic intensity to my desperate outburst. At that moment, the nearby bush was divided with a quick movement. It was a soldier who cleared the way for an assemblage with his sword. Accompanied by a group of beautiful young women, our esteemed queen appeared and slowly moved towards me. She gently pulled her long embroidered veil over the stony ground behind her. It was attached to a golden headband with sparkling jewels that gave her the look of a goddess. She was dressed in the finest white silk wrapped gracefully around her lush body. Baffled by awe and astonishment, I bowed as far down as I could in my shameful position on the stretcher. I didn't dare look her in the eye. That might have taken me straight back to the dungeon. Instead, I remained in my awestruck position until I felt a gentle pat on my shoulder. At that point, I was petrified and too afraid to look up, so I only partially raised my gaze and noticed a pair of beautiful, soft hands with long fingers ending in carefully groomed nails. With a gentle motion, the owner of these beautiful hands gave me a sign to straighten up from my bow. These were undoubtedly the hands of Anexi, and a wave of joy so great that I could hardly control myself flowed through my body. Immediately I could feel my phallus stir, but to survive the day, I tried with superhuman efforts to keep it from ascending. Carefully I raised my head and was struck by Anexi's smile. Her eyes were painted with black pigment. It would protect her from evil, but it also made her eyes appear as a dominant feature in her otherwise small face. Her aura exerted such a strong influence on me that I was inclined to throw my arms around her and receive her presence hot and violently. Although my heart languished for love, I pulled myself together so as not to do the wrong thing with exuberant emotions and excitement. I paused in the magic of her compassionate gaze and waited. As Anexi began to speak, I noticed a flat elevation in her chest which at the same time raised her nipples slightly. Although it was completely insignificant to everyone else, I perceived it with such passion that I almost missed what she was saying. My queen wants the tree goddess to come back to life. She wants you to take over this task. Nobody had ever spoken to me in a soft tone, and certainly not with a tender voice like hers, which at that moment came over me like a loving melody. So it took me some time to understand the meaning of her words. I was also stunned that our queen had elevated my tree to the status of a tree goddess, which meant that the fruits and woods were to be used for grave goods in her tomb, the construction of which was well advanced. I nodded thoughtfully. I will do my best to satisfy our queen's wish. Before she continued, Anexi took a deep breath, her nipples protruding again. My queen noticed that the tree goddess began to decay shortly after you stopped taking the morning dew from her. My queen has also found her bath less satisfying ever since. I nodded again as I tried to grasp the sincerity of her words. May I express my sympathy for the discomfort of our queen. I will begin to collect the dew as soon as my legs are strong enough to carry me to the tree goddess. Anexi's face discolored slightly. Judging by her body language, my answer was not good enough. She turned gracefully to our queen to address her. I watched them talk to each other, and it was obvious that our queen and Anexi had an intimate relationship. My queen wishes you to be picked up by her soldiers every morning and brought here to collect the dew and take care of the tree goddess, Anexi said. Our queen's wish is my command, I replied, and bowed as best as I could. Then something very unusual happened. The queen raised her head to speak to me. Immediately I lowered my eyes to avoid hers, but she said, "Look up, Naguib." Startled, I looked up. She knew my name? The queen spoke. You were born as one of the few innocent. I trust in your absolute loyalty and devotion to make the tree goddess well again. She coughed before she continued. As soon as you have fulfilled your task, a wish will be granted to you, the queen said with a smile that broke her otherwise rigid facial expression. Your words speak of such generosity, I managed to say, and put my hand on my heart as a gesture of gratitude. The queen nodded and left with her entourage. While Anexi followed her queen, she turned to me and gave me an obscure hand signal, which irritated me even more in my complete confusion. When they had disappeared behind the surrounding bushes, I began to relax very slowly. That was not a dream, although what had happened felt completely unreal. The slaves carried me back to the sick chamber. Exhausted and feverish, I stretched out on my straw mat and fell into a deep sleep. Some time later I woke up briefly and noticed that damp blankets were laid on me, and the care-woman dabbed my face with a wet cloth. The next time I came to, the healing powers of the spirits had done their work. I felt fresh, my fever had dropped, and I could think clearly again. Anexi's beautiful face was the first thing I had in mind. I remembered every muscle moving around her lips as she had spoken to me, and every blink and sparkle of her eyes as she had looked at me. We had exchanged words, and the ice between us was broken. Without being able to explain it, I now saw her in a different light. We had reached a mutual agreement that went beyond what had been discussed. Her hand signal still puzzled me. I had never seen it before, and wondered what she had meant. It had almost looked like an invitation as she had stretched out her left arm to me, had opened her hand, and had then pulled her arm back as her slender fingers had slowly rolled in, and then her whole hand had rolled in like a breaking wave of the great water. Did her hand signal have to do with the wish that the queen would grant me something after successfully completing my task. Not long, and I heard the soldiers coming to pick me up. This time the stretcher was different. It was a royal one, with a soft mattress and even a pillow on which my head could rest. All my life I had slept on the cold stone floor without a mattress, pillow, or blanket, and so I felt like the king himself when I sat down on the comfortable stretcher. One of the soldiers gestured for me to lie down and use the time to rest. I was too nervous to relax, but I did as I was told. 2 slaves unknown to me, whose fate I had shared a while ago, took over the task of carrying the stretcher and me, while 4 of the Queen's soldiers were ordered to watch over me. I was relieved that the journey was not half as bumpy as the day before. The accompanying soldiers marched in step that was followed by the slaves. All the while I thought about how I could save the tree goddess from death. When we arrived there, I was still very weak, but I could walk around the tree. Carefully, I divided the lower branches to step into its weeping crown. To my joyful surprise, the inner leaves still looked green, and despite the tree's bad condition, some dew was still gathering on them. My sparkling silver cup was in my pouch. As I reached down to get it out, I noticed fruits lying on the ground. They looked rotten, and a foul smell emanated from them, so I picked one up to examine it. On the side was a slit that I didn't think was natural. It could only have been added to the fruit with a sharp object. I collected more fruit and noticed the same cut on each one of them. On further examination, I found a torn and discarded palm fiber sling, which had most likely been used as an aid in climbing the tree goddess. During my childhood, I often had had contact with our slave farmers through friends and had watched them at work. Therefore, I knew that our farmers had applied the practice of fruit gashing to speed up the ripening of fig tree fruits. Figs were nutritious and easy to obtain because the fig tree was native to our area and therefore easy to cultivate. But the tree goddess was not a fig tree. She was a ginkgo tree with fan-shaped leaves, a symbol of longevity. The ginkgo was a successor to our conifers, showing the transition from needle to leaf in its unique leaf texture. The tree goddess was a relic from a time before the daily journeys of the sun god Ra were counted. Was that the reason why our queen had elevated this ginkgo tree to the status of a tree goddess? While I was collecting the dew from the leaves near the trunk, lost in thought, a sudden understanding enlightened me. This was the work of the lower classes of our society. The poor and uneducated had tried to bring about a faster ripening of the fruit for the one and only reason: hunger. The fruit of the ginkgo, when carefully harvested, produced a nut flesh that was edible in small quantities. Obviously, these people did not know that they would damage the tree goddess if they cut her fruit. Ginkgo trees were not suitable for this practice. But how could I stop them from doing it? On this enlightened day, I collected as much dew as possible, which was not even half of what I had normally collected before my time in the dungeon, and poured it into the beautiful collection jug located at one of the meeting points. Some of the other slaves recognized me and congratulated me that I had survived the dungeon and had been elevated to servant of the queen. Others were jealous and didn't hide their feelings. They were the same ones who hated me for jumping the queue at the lavatory. I assumed that they were relieved not to have me in the slave chamber anymore, and they probably would have preferred it if I had died in the dungeon. Now I was one of the many servants of our queen and responsible for the salvation of the tree goddess. In return, I received the protection of the soldiers who followed me everywhere. Their constant presence gave me security, but I could no longer be alone. Even when I gathered the dew under the weeping crown of the tree goddess, one of the soldiers was always behind me. I wasn't used to so much attention and felt constantly harassed. However, I took my new job very seriously and knew that sooner or later I would have to find a solution to the problem. At least I had found out the cause of it. All that needed to be done was to keep the poor and uneducated away from the tree goddess. An idea came to mind that would certainly prevent them from touching the tree goddess. We needed a divine statue. Every individual, rich or poor, educated or not, reacted to the presence of a statue of the gods with worship and adoration. My next thought made my body tremble. I had to pass the message on to our esteemed queen, and this could only be done with the help of Anexi. The next days passed with a fixed routine. The care-woman woke me long before our sun god Ra let the sun rise, helped me with the toilet, and spoiled me with a hearty breakfast. As a slave, I had been used to a very simple diet all my life, but since I lived in the sick chamber, I had been fed honey-sweet duck and goat meat, bread made from a mixture of different grains, and a variety of fruits and vegetables, such as grapes, pomegranates, chickpeas, leeks, and cabbage. After a long time in the sick chamber, I began to look like a normal person again. After even more time, I noticed my pride and joy twitching under the loincloth due to lack of space. So I asked the care-woman for a new, larger loincloth, which she promptly delivered the next day. After breakfast, the 4 soldiers came to pick me up. They took turns guarding me overnight. I had chosen one of them as my favorite soldier because he spoke nicely to me and was not as stubborn as the others. So I trusted him and asked him to contact our venerable queen on my behalf. His name was Masuda. Unfortunately, it was out of my control to have Masuda with me around the clock, so I considered the time with him special as I spent the following 3 nights with the others in silence. Because of the 4-day rhythm, it took many journeys of the sun god Ra until Masuda came back with news about a meeting with our queen and her personal servant, Anexi. Finally, it was arranged for the day after the next. In the meantime, I had my soldiers build a temporary fence around the tree goddess. A slow recovery had begun almost immediately. It seemed as if some branches had lifted and gained volume. New leaf buds also appeared. However, the low fence could easily be climbed over, and soon I noticed severe damage. An effective solution to prevent further damage to the tree goddess could not come early enough. For a slave, it was one thing to prepare for a meeting with his adored queen, but for one man to see his passionately beloved woman was another. I spent the following 2 nights in agonizing anticipation, in which the exploding moods and sudden twitches of my phallus dominated my already demanding life. I was still very young, and after spending time in the dungeon for a natural reaction to a woman, I worried about my unstoppable sexual appetite. Masuda, who seemed to feel my intense romantic feelings for Anexi, prudently noticed my condition. He was older than my deceased parents, so I had great respect for him and appreciated his wisdom, which he imparted to me through telepathic powers. In some cases, these powers worked between older people and teenagers, but also between a teacher and his student. Not everyone was able to absorb powers in this way, but because I was very sensitive in this regard, Masuda's strong thought affected me so much that it appeared as an image in my soul. Before he spoke, I could see the rapids of the rushing water. "Come, boy, I'll take you to the riverbank, where you shall masturbate." "Why on the riverbank?" I asked. "Your seed shall follow the course of the water," he explained. "But why?" I asked. "Your seed will contribute to fertile soils, the life cycle of our society, and the universal order of things." Our farmers used the banks of our mighty river to grow grain. Wheat, flax, and papyrus fields covered much of the land in its vicinity. For a man like me, who had hardly ever been on our mighty river, the way seemed like a labyrinth. Masuda, who knew the way well, led me on narrow paths covered with black earth through the crops that had grown far beyond my size. My people considered themselves fortunate that our river provided us with seasonal floods caused by the tears of our goddess Isis. She mourned her dead brother and husband Osiris, who had been killed by Seth. The story of Osiris and Isis was an important event that strongly contributed to the spirit of the time and shaped the life and faith of my people. We believed in a golden age when the gods ruled the world. 4 children had emerged from the womb of the goddess of heaven, 2 of whom were Isis and Osiris. They founded the first kingdom which brought knowledge and civilization. The balance between the cosmos and the earth was perfect, and Osiris long ruled the world for the blessing of mankind. But when the sun was under the sign of the scorpion, Seth killed his brother Osiris by placing him in a chest, which he then closed and threw into the sea. Isis searched for Osiris, her husband and brother, and after she had found him, she brought him back to Kemet. Seth, on the other hand, wanted his brother dead and cut him into 14 pieces. But Isis searched every corner of the land, collected the pieces, and wrapped them in linen. However, she had not been able to find the phallus, whereupon she made a golden miracle horn, with which she became pregnant with the seed of Osiris, and gave birth to Horus, a divine child. She had buried each piece of Osiris's body in a different place, so there were several burial places for Osiris in our land. Her tears of sorrow provided the nutrients and minerals that the shore soil needed to remain fertile. It was Horus, the divine child of Isis and Osiris, who became the first established human god, the first pharaoh to rule Kemet. He took over the earthly duties of Osiris and killed Seth for the murder of his father. Since then, Osiris was no longer active on earth, but had been taken back into the world of divine spiritual beings, and helped the dead in the world of spirits on their way between death and a new birth. Isis and Osiris, who had been reborn in heaven, have since been the rulers of life after death. Though I did not deny that Osiris was one as a cosmic being, I believed that he existed undivided in every human soul as a divine spark. The attempt to live like a perfect Osiris would make me perfect and became my ideal, for I wanted to awaken the eternal in me. As we approached the river, I felt the tension of the moving water driven by its strong current. A light breeze carried by the current touched my sensitive skin and ran down my back in a light but long-lasting shower. The feeling was so strong that it put me in a rush of sexual desire. In my mind, I saw pictures of Anexi in front of me, and a longing came over me that I could hardly bear. My hand had already disappeared under my loincloth before Masuda realized the need to give me privacy. When I finally reached the bank of our mighty river, my phallus twitched with impatience to be rubbed, causing me to ejaculate almost immediately. When the flowing droplets of my seed hit the surface of the water, I immediately felt the inner essence of the river, as it was now connected to the spirit of my strong reproductive powers. Exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I lay down. In my sleep, I felt the spiritual being that let the water of our mighty river taste sweet and nutritious for future generations. After this event, I felt relieved and could face the meeting with Anexi and the Queen with peace and serenity. The sun slowly rose above the horizon, and the sun spirits sent by our sun god Ra greeted the day with their blessings. I could see the image of them clearly in front of me as I waited for our revered queen and Anexi after collecting the dew. While Masuda remained nearby for moral support, the other 3 soldiers spent their time polishing their spears, axes, and swords. We didn't have to wait long. Our heads all shot up at once when we heard the leading soldier giving his orders in a loud voice. Soon we saw our queen and her assemblage against the strike of the sun. The glare of the white sand dazzled me temporarily. The attention of all present was on our esteemed queen, only my eyes looked at Anexi. She looked beautiful in her white linen dress loosely covering her slender body. Her wrists and ankles were adorned with jewelry of precious stones and glass beads. An amulet around her neck, consisting of red stone with 2 equal curves meeting at a point at the lower end and a hump at the upper end, radiated an energy of special significance. It immediately had an upward effect on me, as I firmly believed it would protect the wearer's heart from physical and mental damage in life and after death. As I smiled inside, I bowed to her. When I straightened up again, Our eyes met, and we fused as the sky merged with the horizon. You let us know that you found the cause of the death of the tree goddess, and also a way to save her, Anexi asked. I did, I said confidently. Then speak, Naguib, ordered the queen, who stood 2 steps behind Anexi. This was the moment when I realized that Anexi had become my highest priestess, and that no one, not even our revered queen, could compete with Anexi's rank in my heart. Nevertheless, I bowed to her before I spoke. Dear Queen, I began, allow me to explain with clear words. It seems as if it was the poor and uneducated members of society who took the liberty of cutting the fruit so that it would ripen more quickly. This is the custom with fig trees, but the tree goddess is a ginkgo tree. She does not tolerate such treatment. This is the reason why she almost died. The queen was visibly impressed by my results. She came 1 step closer and made direct eye contact with me, which was terribly unpleasant for me. Explain to me what you intend to do to remedy this grievance, she ordered. I took a step back to escape her immediate physical proximity. Allow me to express my thoughts honestly, which are by no means intended as criticism, I said. I expect nothing but honesty, the queen replied. I bowed even deeper. Dear Queen, if you provided enough food for the poor and uneducated, this kind of behavior would stop. The queen looked stunned. I immediately regretted my words and expected my old master to be called to whip me. What are your other thoughts? The queen asked instead, and I continued. Allow me to recommend the erection of a statue that would clarify the status of the tree goddess and invite prayer instead of eating from her. This time my words triggered a positive reaction. Our queen nodded approvingly, as did Anexi, whom I saw from the corner of my eye. I suppose, Naguib, that your insights and suggestions make sense in the universal order of things. We will have statues made by our artists around the tree goddess. I immediately felt elated and said, I am deeply grateful that you find my thoughts useful, revered queen. After a long silence, which served to reflect on what had been said, Anexi spoke to me again. Since you have been collecting dew again, my queen has found her bath satisfactory anew. Anexi smiled at me and nodded. I smiled back. At that moment, the voices of the All-Spirits sang the sweetest melody in full harmony. Together, we experienced an ecstatic soul condition that was more than just a dream. It gave us a view of our future, where we saw fleeting glimpses of what was to come. What our senses perceived in earthly matters at that moment did not correspond to the truth, but that what went beyond became our truth. We communicated in a mutual understanding of compassion and love. It was a moment I will never forget. The queen broke off our enchanting journey with a snap of her finger, which also meant that it was time to go. She and her entourage turned around, but before Anexi turned her eyes away from me, she gave me the mysterious hand signal again, the meaning of which rested like an unopened bud on my soul, and which I slowly began to understand. Time seemed to pass slowly as I continued to collect the morning dew before and during many sunrises. The harvest was already in full swing, and as I had fully recovered from my ordeal in the dungeon, I decided to help the farmers. This decision also arose from boredom. I was waiting, blessedly, to hear from our queen and Anexi about the erection of the statues. So the harvest came at a time that suited me well. The paper reed had grown to enormous heights this year, because the mud that our mighty river had deposited during the last flood was very rich in nutrients. Equipped with a wooden serrated tool, I began to cut the reed at the beginning of the day, right after my dew collection, and finished my work at nightfall. After the whole paper reed had been cut and stacked, I was given the task of peeling the inside of the triangular stem into long strips, which were then laid on top of each other in layers, dried and pressed. After the dried layers had been glued and mounted on rolls, the writing material was created and sold to our libraries, schools, scribes, and accountants. It was a worthwhile job because it reminded me of the slave farmers I had often watched as a child. They had done this kind of laborious work all their lives. In an intuitive moment, I understood why these people, despite their hard work, had always been satisfied with their lives. It was because they helped Thought, the god of wisdom, to create the paper on which our scholars wrote down their insights and knowledge about the spiritual beings in our universe and the events that took place on our earth. Signs and symbols had their own magical power and could come to life. Wisdoms were eternalized. After 3 full moons, I received a message from Anexi through Masuda. The provisional fence would be torn down, and the statues would be erected in the coming days. The tree goddess would not be accessible for dew collection during this time, and I would receive further information as soon as I could return there. The latter did not come long after that. Our artists and sculptors worked quickly and efficiently. Since I was healthy again, Masuda remained my only guard soldier, and he accompanied me to the tree goddess again this morning. At this time, the flooding time was long overdue. The new mud was supposed to supply the areas around our mighty river with minerals and new nutrients, but the longed-for rain was missing. Our farmers were worried because without any flood there could be no harvest. In the long term, this meant that many of us would go hungry and our economy could eventually collapse. Naturally, I firmly believed that the wrath of the gods was at work and took this unusual event to be a bad omen. Also, that particular morning it was unusually hot, and the winds from the great water were blowing a hot and dry air over the desert land. When we arrived at the tree goddess, we could hardly believe what we saw before us. There were altogether 5 noble statues, which had been set up at the same distance around the tree goddess. Each showed the same standing woman with a headdress of cow horns and a sun disk, but each statue showed different gestures. The cow horns were not unusual. I had already seen some statues of gods with animal heads, for our gods and goddesses were depicted as they had lived on earth long before humans had arrived. The statues in front of me reminded me of the goddess Hathor, or one of our smaller goddesses who helped the women with the birth, the dead with the rebirth, and the cosmos with the renewal. As I slowly walked around them, I noticed with great surprise that each statue depicted part of Anexi's hand signals. The first had her left arm stretched out, the second showed her left arm stretched out with her palm up, the third showed her retracted left arm with her fingers rolling inwards, the fourth had her arm, fingers and hand retracted in a wave, and the 5th statue completed the hand signal with her retracted arm and the back of her fist touching her left shoulder. Now more than ever, I wanted to know the meaning of these hand signs, but at the same time I was fascinated by the beauty of these statues. They were made entirely of glittering marble, their fingernails and toenails of silver, and their eyes of solid glass beads. The ivory cow horns enclosed the sun disk, which was a huge red gemstone. The body was wrapped in a golden pleated dress, similar to Anexi's linen dress, with the contours of the goddess's body shimmering through. The long hair that descended in a golden sheath around the goddess's shoulders also showed a resemblance to Anexi. Awed and amazed, I looked at the statues. Could they have a deeper meaning than just protecting the tree goddess from abuse? Our revered queen had Anexi depicted in the statues to protect the tree goddess. It was customary for queens, kings, and pharaohs to have themselves depicted in divine statues to create something of their spiritual selves. Had our queen chosen Anexi, her personal servant, to replace her? Also, the hand signal had to be of great importance. Otherwise, she would not have let it be presented in such detail. I sat down in the shadow of the tree goddess and thought for a long time. The hand signal could be interpreted in one way or another. Since it referred to an invitation, one of its meanings could refer to love, devotion, fertility, and belonging. That was exactly what I wanted. But it could also refer to death and the hereafter, an invitation to accompany. My heart sank. Was our queen dying, and my Anexi with her? Was Anexi condemned to die with our queen to serve her in life after death? I shook my head in despair. It could not be that the spirits of the universe had given us insights into our common future in the flesh, if Anexi would have to leave our earthly world before. I went into a trance-like state, one in which I concentrated on nothing other than the image that slowly but surely formed in my soul. There was only one other explanation. The queen was dying, and she granted her rule to Anexi. Her impending death was also the reason why our queen had elevated the old ginkgo to tree goddess, so that parts of the ancient wisdom and medical properties of the tree were added to our queen's grave and allowed her a carefree life after death, in wisdom and without inconvenience. Yes, it was said that the quality of the afterlife had changed over thousands of years. What the scholars of earlier civilizations described as pure and enriching in life after death deviated from the insights of our scholars. In my time, people had an increasing connection to the physical world, which made the spiritual world more difficult to access after death. We gave great importance to the preservation of the earthly body so that it could send signals to its soul after death. It seemed that in the civilizations before us, embalming and burial objects had not been regarded as essential to provide for comfort in the afterlife. The marriage between the spiritual world and the material world had begun in my century, and our revered queen was fully aware that not only earthly things were constantly changing, but also that our soul had entered into new living conditions after death. Since there were now 5 statues, they had to be protected and worshipped. The area around the tree goddess turned into a temple-like place. There was an army of soldiers, priests, worshippers, and those who cared for the goddesses. My people firmly believed that the living, the dead, and the gods all had the same basic needs for shelter, food and drink, hygiene, rest and recreation, so that the statues were supplied with offerings in the form of food, clothing, jewelry, and utensils for daily life. The seclusion and tranquility during the morning collection had, unfortunately, disappeared. Nevertheless, I regarded this as a small price, because the tree goddess recovered quickly. Her branches rose, the leaf buds formed in large numbers, the fruits grew, and soon there was again a multitude of birds and insects fluttering around. It lasted 3 cycles of the full moon, and the tree goddess was again in her original healthy state. Because the rainfall had been scarce, Masuda arranged for the water to be carried from our mighty river to the tree goddess. Had our great goddess Isis stopped crying to her dead husband Osiris? Why did the gods behave so strangely? The combination of the lack of rain and the bad health of our queen could be a sign that the earthly was reduced to a minimum to give new impulses to the gods. Was the goddess Isis over her grief, and was she hinting at a change in the spiritual as well as the earthly world? Were we on our way into a new age? Soon there were rumors about the deteriorating state of health of the queen. Her tomb, which had been beaten into the desert rocks and whose construction had already begun years ago, quickly took shape. The portico was framed by magnificent columns, and our artists were busy depicting scenes from everyday life in pictures. The portico led into a columned hall that allowed access to a sacrificial chapel where the statue of our revered queen had just been erected. May the gods forgive me, but I found that our esteemed queen had never been an attractive woman. She was tall with oversized limbs and rough facial features, but her statue was embellished to the smallest detail. This would be the place where she would receive offerings of food and necessities of daily life to give her a pleasant life after death. The burial chamber was under the sacrificial chapel, and access was through an opening in the ground. The burial chamber was to carry our queen's coffin with her mummified body. The interior walls were just decorated with carved and painted scenes, which were kept secret at that time because of their sentimental value. At the time, I lived in a small mud brick house which had been given to me by the queen. Consisting of 2 rooms, it was just big enough for me. One room was for sleeping and the other for sitting and eating. It was pleasant to be in there because the mud walls kept the heat out and the only window provided a pleasant breeze. As a servant of the queen, My status had increased enormously, and many of my old companions treated me differently. Some avoided me out of respect, not to humiliate me with their acquaintance. None of my forefathers had ever made it this far, and I wasn't sure whether it was pure luck or whether the gods and spirits had chosen me to rise above the others for a purpose. I sensed that my new destiny had only just begun and was prepared for more to come. I waited eagerly for a message from our very sick queen, as she had not yet fulfilled her promise to grant me a wish. By now, everyone knew that she was dying and that a successor had been elected. With that in mind, our markets began to fill with new traders from other lands. They tried to trade silk, gold, silver, ivory, and other foreign artifacts for grain, linen, and papyrus. The air was tingling with excitement about the new era that was about to begin. Yet first our esteemed queen had to receive her full burial rites after her earthly death, and the preparations were in full swing. Special priests, appointed guardians of a secret knowledge given by the gods, searched our magic books in the library to find spells they would proclaim during the funeral. Their magical rituals would help our queen's rebirth. Artists and sculptors built figures in the form of soldiers and servants to protect our queen and serve her in the afterlife. Many grave goods, such as clothes, jewelry, bowls, furniture, vases, and other essentials, were brought to the cliff grave. Wailing women, who came from everywhere, were recruited by the high priest of the temple, not only to lament at the funeral service, but also to make people aware of the impending death of our revered queen by singing and dancing. The best embalmers in the country were brought in to help mummify our queen's body. "Naguib, quickly! Our queen demands your presence!" I woke from a sleep full of dreams of Anexi and felt the drops of sweat from Masuda's face dripping down on me. He shook my arm hard and tried to get me up as quickly as possible. I shot up with a fright. "When? Where?" "At sunset near the tree goddess," Masuda said. I stepped outside to see how much time was left. At least I had to bathe and dress cleanly before the meeting I had been waiting for so feverishly. In the distance, I saw that the sun god Ra almost touched the horizon. "Help me, Masuda. Get clean clothes and sandals. You'll find me in the bathhouse." With a racing heart and thoughts and feelings in turmoil, I ran over to the communal bathhouse. A group of men were gathering around in the water, discussing politics, but I ignored them. They watched me amused as I jumped into and out of the water in seconds, while Masuda arrived with a clean white linen dress and leather sandals in his hands. It was unusual to see a soldier behaving like a personal servant, and the gossip that resulted would have probably spread like a wildfire. But on this special day, I didn't care what my people would think or say about me. I had a very important appointment to attend on, which I could finally express my innermost wish. Masuda and I reached the tree goddess shortly before our esteemed queen and her entourage arrived. As always, Anexi stood out with her radiant beauty, and with her seductive smile, she mercilessly demanded my full attention. As it had happened before, I took in this unique woman with my senses and felt how her inner essence touched me. It confirmed what I had always known, our common harmony in the realm of love. As if my phallus had its own stubborn mind, the blood shot into it at such a speed that it reached its full capacity within a second. It was impossible to prevent this event, and silently I thanked Masuda with all my blessings for choosing a loose linen dress that covered the lower part of my trembling body with generous folds. It took a superhuman effort to get myself out of Anexi's spell. Only then did I notice the two-wheeled carriage carrying our weak queen. Clumsily I went over to her and bowed deeply. I did not dare to look her in the face for fear of revealing shock at her appearance. Masuda had fortunately warned me that our revered queen was covered with an ugly rash of wetting blisters and red spots. No one should approach her less than astride, and touching her was out of the question. Not that I ever wanted to touch my queen. I now stood about 2 steps away from her, with my eyes pointing downwards. "Look up, Naguib," the queen ordered. I did as I was told. The queen was covered from top to bottom with white linen bandages and a soft veil. Her face was behind a cloth held by a headdress. She looked as if she had already been embalmed. You did your job well, Naguib. The tree goddess has recovered. I nodded. Unfortunately, the dew couldn't heal me, she said in a shaky voice. My heart sank. Would she not fulfill my wish now? After a little while, in which she relaxed again, she continued. I would like to have some grave goods carved from the wood of the tree goddess. Do you think the tree could spare some wood? In small measure, yes, I answered. Keep the wood ready for collection tomorrow at sunset, she ordered. Yes, my queen. She leaned back into her soft pillows. Now tell me your wish. I took a step to the left, as I always did when I felt uncomfortable. Fortunately, my phallus had relaxed, and so had my posture. I swallowed before I spoke. This was the first time in my life that I was allowed to make a wish, and above all, in front of the queen. I would like to have Anexi as my wife. Finally it was out, and I exhaled softly. That doesn't surprise me, Naguib, the queen said without hesitation. I blushed. How had she known that? The queen continued, I have heard of your strong reproductive powers, and that you are in the right physical and mental condition to leave Anexi with royal offspring. My head shot up. Royal offspring? I asked. Yes, you heard right. Anexi will be the next queen after my earthly death. She will reign with you at her side over my temple and lands. I froze. Had the spirits of the universe gone mad? Not in my wildest dreams had I thought that I could be appointed king of the temple. Normally there were battles for thrones, and royal blood had to continue flowing through the generations. In this case it was not royal blood because our queen had no children. The queen ignored my confusion and went on. In return, I expect you to produce as many descendants as possible to keep the royal blood strong and eternal. Yes, my queen, I said, and bowed. Was she out of her mind because of her illness, or was there something I didn't know? I became dizzy, my hands trembled, and my phallus became impatient again. Then something surprising happened. The queen gave Anexi a sign that she was to approach me. Anexi took me by the hand and led me away from the others. It was a strange feeling when I left with her, for all my limbs, including my phallus, were as stiff as a board. Electrified by the news, I blindly followed my beloved Anexi. When I think back today, I miss the whole distance from the place where we started to the place where she led me. Eventually I found myself in a courtyard inside the temple walls that had been turned into a lush garden. A huge loft bed stood between bush and flowering plants. It was decorated with colorful artifacts, each pointing to fertilization and the pleasures of the flesh. Anexi, who was still holding my hand, turned to me. Our queen wants us to experience the rite of initiation before we get married. But why? I asked. To release the source of power in my womb and your phallus, so that our common orgasmic potential leads us into a state of being beyond what we know today. I looked at her in disbelief. We already know what lies beyond our understanding of earthly love. We experienced a vision of our future, where we saw fleeting glimpses of what was to come. I am aware, Anexi said, but our queen wants to be sure that what we experienced then in our spiritual realm will actually be transferred to our earthly duties as future king and queen. That was a blow to me. It meant that I had to make love with Anexi to show that I could have children. But what if Anexi didn't become pregnant? Was there enough time before the queen died? Besides my doubts, I also realized that even if I became Anexi's husband, I would still be a slave because the queen had only fulfilled my wish under conditions. I was to become the biological life force behind the royal succession. Anexi had to be blood-related to the queen. Maybe Anexi didn't know herself? Anger arose in me. It was outrageous to want to use me for this purpose. I felt insulted. I know how you feel, Naguib, Anexi said gently. Even if you feel so, always remember the deep affection we have for each other, and that our children will be conceived and born out of love. But what happens if I fail to leave you with child now? I asked. You will not fail, Anexi assured me. Her certainty freed my mind. After all, I now had everything I had ever wanted. I had grown up as a slave and was trained to listen and do what I was told. For my own sanity, I decided not to question what was given to me any longer. Anexi raised her hands and caressed my face tenderly. She knew what I was going through, and her compassion made me feel at ease. At that moment, my queen of love pressed her lovely body against mine, and my senses told me the one and only thing. I had to possess her then and there. Together, we climbed the steps to the royal bed. Anexi gently pushed me down and undressed me. When she reached for my twitching phallus, all the spirits of this world came down on me, and I slid into a powerful orgasm that consumed me with such energy that I called out her name several times. She gently touched my lips. I greedily grabbed her hand and guided her to the belt of her dress. Then she began to undress slowly. Her delightful breasts were crowned by 2 tender nipples. Immediately I felt the urge to suck on them, which in turn plunged her into a sexual delirium. I kissed her everywhere, touched her, felt her, tasted her, heard her sigh loudly, and finally dived into her with a lust for which I found no words. At first I pressed gently to deflower her without pain, but then my blasts became faster and stronger until I reached my second orgasm with a loud moan. I could feel my sperm splashing into her untouched womb in fast and powerful jets, and with each wave Anexi's legs opened more in full readiness. When we leaned back exhausted, we floated for a long time in the harmony of our warm afterplay. "You made the earth move," she whispered. I smiled into her loving eyes. "Only the gods can do that." She pondered briefly before she said, "I need a god to master my coming journey because I do not feel the power of the divine in me." I took her in my arms. "I will always be at your side." Anexi had 4 new moons of her pregnancy behind her when Masuda announced that the queen's cousin, Adolfo, was on his way to ascend the throne. This was a shock to everyone, but above all to me, because my beloved Anexi was now in great danger of being killed. Our queen's illness had progressed, and her condition was worse than ever before. She hardly responded to her surroundings, and we all waited for the god of the dead to bring her salvation. So it was Anexi's task to act as her deputy until the queen's death, when Anexi herself was to become queen. I had never been involved in such conflicts before, and felt like a lost shooting star in the vast universe. Masuda knew what was going on with me, and gave me comfort and certainty through his constant presence. I felt his full loyalty for both of us, Anexi and me. He cared for us as if we were his own children. At that time, we lived within the high stone walls of the temple, which served as a massive barrier to keep attackers away. Adolfo quickly approached with an army of foot soldiers equipped with lances, clubs, and axes. Masuda was particularly concerned about bullet weapons such as arrows and bows, spears and slingshots with fireballs that could reach beyond the walls of the temple to cause destruction within. In preparation for an imminent attack on the temple, Masuda ordered all flammable items to be removed. Animal and storage sites usually containing straw, fabrics, oils, dried herbs, and grain were emptied. The goods were moved to the stone chambers inside the temple. Anexi had shields made of solid wood with heavy leather. At least this would allow her people to move freely within the temple without being hit by an arrow. According to Masuda, the hail of arrows was one of Adolfo's most frequently used attack techniques. For that very reason, Masuda had chosen to adopt the same strategy. Anexi herself received an army of bodyguards and would remain in a shelter in the middle of the temple during an attack. This special room was equipped with a secret underground escape route leading directly to our mighty river. Boats loaded with provisions and ready to go anchored near the exit. Temple servants supplying the temple grounds with supplies and other economic goods were carefully inspected before being let in through the large main gate. Priests who performed the religious rituals and ceremonies paid special tribute to the local temple gods and prayed for peace and stability. Masuda passionately polished his spearhead, which was made of obsidian with a serrated tip. Obsidian was imported from the areas in the eastern Red Sea, a volcanic glass that was often used for weapons because of its flexibility. Due to my anxiety, I reacted very sensitively to his telepathic thoughts, and saw Masuda standing before me in my mind covered in blood, before I spoke. "What are you up to, Masuda?" He promptly answered, "My soldiers and I will catch Adolfo and his army before they reach our temple." He placed his long spear in front of him and pointed to the tip. "With this I will stab Adolfo through the heart." The shine of the polished, translucent black-green glass reflected one half of his determined face. At that thought, I became uncomfortable, and I did a step sideways. As much as I wanted Anexi to be safe, yet having to have a man killed for it was beyond my moral understanding. "Why didn't our queen grant him dominion? After all, he has royal blood?" I asked. "Just like Anexi," Masuda said objectively. "Anexi has royal blood, but she is a personal servant of the queen." Masuda looked me in the eyes. "This may be a surprise, Naguib, but Anexi is the daughter of a slave who was left with child by the only deceased son of our revered queen." "So Anexi is our queen's grandchild," I said. "Yes, and so she is more closely related to our queen than the cousin," Masuda said. My suspicions had come true. At last it became clear to me why our queen had chosen Anexi as her royal heir. I had asked Anexi several times before about her blood relationship with the queen, but she had always objected to speak about it. "Then why does Adolfo demand kingship?" I asked. Masuda was glad to share the background with me, and began, "That is an old story. It goes back for many generations, but Adolfo always insisted on being the rightful king of this temple and its lands. When our mighty river irrigated the valley with its annual flood, it divided it into natural basins, creating the temples and their lands. In the past, however, our land had always been more fertile than that of others. In addition, our peasants and craftsmen supported our temple with a harvest tax, which in most cases consisted of grain. This grain was traded for other raw materials, like obsidian, food, papyrus, oils, and linen. Adolfo's ancestors worked on lands with less fertile soils, leaving the economy of their temple behind ours. When a blood relationship between the two families was revealed, Adolfo insisted that he belonged to our temple. When Adolfo and his soldiers approached our temple grounds, Masuda and his army marched to meet them. He was convinced that he could defeat his enemy in a quick and hard fight before Adolfo reached us. The two armies met under the hot midday sun. It was clear from the beginning that Masuda's soldiers were not only better equipped, but also stronger and more energetic, with an insatiable desire to fight. Masuda's archers, who sent arrow showers from some distance, followed the spear-bearers. Adolfo's soldiers had neither shields nor armor, so there were many injuries with flesh wounds, and much blood flowed. Those wounded by arrows died the death of the spear. When most of them were knocked down, Adolfo attacked Masuda with a loud, angry scream, but Masuda, who had waited for him, thrust the tip of his shining spear directly into Adolfo's heart, just as he had prophesied. Yet Masuda did not escape unscathed. He had contracted a nasty wound to his upper arm and lost much blood. Our priest doctors treated his wound with a mixture of honey, garlic, and castor oil, and after a short time he was back on his feet. When the message of victory reached us, I held Anexi in my arms. She felt awkward from all the stresses, and I thanked our goddess of health and well-being that Masuda had put an end to it all. But Anexi could not recover. Like me, she struggled with the thought that her distant relative had been killed to her advantage. It burdened us heavily, and Anexi remained bedridden for weeks. Her belly grew, but she could not find joy in bringing her first child into the world. Although I never left her alone for more than a quarter of a day, she demanded my presence all the time. Yes, we had become an inseparable couple. Each of us held on to the other. But her depression also drew me into the darkness, because it took me a lot of strength to respond to her. To cure our suffering, the highest priestly scholar of the temple proposed to put Anexi into a temple sleep. He was convinced that this special treatment would heal her. Anexi's consciousness would artificially be dimmed to put her into a kind of hypnotic sleep. The specialized priest-physicians and scholars would then be able to see the images of her soul world that developed around her. These images would lead the specialists to find their way back to Anexi's physical body. From this, they would learn which remedy to use to heal Anexi. The temple sleep was only applied to the richest and most important members of our society, because it required much spiritual knowledge to interpret the soul images. Only the most competent and oldest scholars could do such a treatment. Anexi was placed in the holiest chamber of the temple, surrounded by statues of gods and goddesses. The latter were pampered with the best food and incense so that they would visit Anexi in her dreams in high spirits. This would serve as another source of information for Anexi's treatment, as the influence of the gods and goddesses would contribute to her soul images. During this time, no one but the medical specialists and priests were near her to avoid distractions. I spent the days and nights of her absence in deep sorrow, and time seemed to pass very slowly. Desperate as I was, 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. What would become of me if she did not wake up again? What if Anexi's temple sleep, as in some cases before, went unsuccessfully? It had already been applied in vain to our revered queen. I became very skeptical. Nevertheless, I said to myself, it was worth a try to get my Anexi out of her dilemma. When Anexi awoke from her temple sleep after 3 sunrises, the specialist prepared a medicine that Anexi drank 3 times a day. The magician was invited to visit her regularly to recite spells and draw magic protective circles around her with an ivory wand. Finally, the day came when Anexi woke up with a smile again. As if the gods had planned and organized it, our revered queen died 7 sunrises after Anexi's new awakening. Immediately, loud wails filled the otherwise calm atmosphere, and life in and around the temple accelerated with the preparations for the funeral. Our queen's body was brought to the banks of our mighty river, where it was given a cleansing ritual before being mummified. Anexi and I had prepared ourselves long in advance for this event, and we went with the crowds. It was a long and exhausting journey, and I supported Anexi as much as I could. It did not surprise me that she was deeply affected by the death of her queen. Not only had our queen and Anexi enjoyed a very close relationship, but they had also been family. The ritual was performed by a high priest who prepared our queen for her entrance into the spiritual world of the dead. On this day, our sun god Ra showed no mercy to the crowd and shone mercilessly upon it. Some wondered if this was a bad prophecy, but Anexi and I held our heads up to show trust and goodwill. We had an agreement regarding the future politic of the temple and its lands, which we absolutely wanted to realize. A change was imminent that would affect the whole of society. As dawn broke, an exhausted crowd slowly went back to the temple, while the embalmers took over our queen's body for the mummification process. This would take 70 days, enough time to prepare for the funeral and form a reformed temple with new political structures. Anexi began the coronation ritual the next day at sunrise to symbolize the restoration of stability and the supremacy of truth and justice. She had already made the preparations at the request of the queen before her death, so that the attire and jewelry for the coronation were already there. Besides her fine linen and silk dress, which was cinched at the waist with a belt, her only ornament was a brightly polished golden headband. At its center, a golden cobra reared up, aligning with Anexi's nasal bone. The shiny headband stood in stark contrast to her black hair. Anexi didn't want to be compared to a goddess, so she wore her hair loosely around her shoulders. She also refused a formal collar, but instead wore her red stone amulet, which she always wore, and which had once had an enormous uplifting effect on me. In comparison to our deceased queen, Anexi's presentation was very reserved, and many looked at her astonished. As usual, she walked along a marked path, indicating that she had taken possession of her kingdom and chose the title by which she was to become known, Anexi, Queen of the People. When she positioned herself to address her people from an elevated temple platform, she held me close by her side. I could feel the warmth emanating from her wonderful body, and despite the official moment, my phallus gave me an impatient sign. Anexi felt my excitement and looked deep into my eyes before turning to the excited crowd to speak. "You, my fellow people, the gods have come to me in my dreams. The spirits of the universe reveal that change is due. I will be your queen. My temple will be your temple. Trust, honesty, and compassion will guide us, so that each of us can live a good life. No one will suffer hunger. No one will die from a disease that can be treated. No one will rot in the dungeon. We will be strong and survive hard times, building on the past and the present, for a better future." The crowd went silent. Anexi's words were far ahead of our time. Apart from our spiritual initiates, no one had ever indicated a change, let alone a better future. My people lived from day to day and were guided by the past and the gods. Everything was geared towards permanence and continuity. There was no room for ambiguity. Change and future were terms that were hardly used. Everyone was visibly shaken by the new concepts that was hardly understood. The air crackled with tension and confusion. Anexi drew me even closer to her. I could literally taste her wetness, and when she opened her mouth again to finish off her speech, the vibration of her voice settled on me, like the golden spray of the first morning dew. "Go home and contemplate. Speak with our scholars. Ask the gods and the universe for inspiration. Seek enlightenment." It took a long time for the crowd to recover from the shock. Then it turned into cheers and applause. Anexi had conquered the tradition and ignorance of her people with a new vision and charm. Now I had to have her. I dragged her away from the crowd and into the cool rooms of the temple. We began to undress at the same time. The effect of the experience just lived, previously unknown, drove us deep into a madness of desire. In the rising afternoon winds, trapped between the walls of the temple in a vortex of sandy air and steaming breaths, I shuddered in my sweat escaping through every pore of my skin. I had to hold myself back so as not to rush at her to relieve my throbbing phallus. Our unborn child was kicking excitedly in its mother's womb. We paused for a moment to observe the playful movements, as Anexi's abdomen pressed in and out in various places. The baby, fruit of our eternal love, seemed to give us a joyful message of its existence. We shared an indescribably beautiful moment of happiness before Anexi lay down on her side so that I could carefully enter her from behind. It felt like my whole body was merging with hers as we became one in the cosmic vastness of our love. Gradually, there were changes. Anexi and I discussed with the priests how the temple could be transformed into a people's temple. The main gate was open to the public, and free basic food and beer were offered in the shade of a large canopy. However, the true state of our society soon became clear. Trade was slow due to lack of grain. The floods had been low for an entire season, and only the farmers whose fields were near the riverbank had the advantage of a small harvest. This meant that many people were hungry. The flip side of the situation was that now our people had time to inform themselves about the policy of our new temple. Writers and artists helped prepare new boards with engraved hieroglyphics and images that had a new message. Teachers, priests, and spiritual leaders volunteered to explain the new meaning to the members of our society. Traditionally, the ancient comedian image was a static, clear image. A figure was depicted either sitting or just before a movement, never while walking. It was avoided to depict movement because movement meant a process of transience. The image of a person was also very clear. The face was drawn in profile, but had a frontal eye that was much more expressive than an eye in side view. The new message was about the opposite of consistency and continuity. It was about change and volatility, ambiguity and transient moments. The new images showed scenes of movement, like a hunter throwing a spear at an animal. The spear was about to hit the animal, a walking woman with her infant and farmers cutting grain. The current situation was depicted in a picture showing drought and hunger, huge, empty fields with torn soil and desperate people. This was not an abstract idea, but a realistic state, referring to the uncertainty and volatility of the weather conditions and their impact on humankind. Our people took it up with openness and understanding as everyone was affected by the extraordinary drought. But apart from that, they were used to accepting what they were told, just like me. The funeral of our deceased queen was to take place soon. The embalmment was already in full swing. It was a complex process that had to be carried out according to traditional methods. Her body was slit at the sides to remove the kidneys, liver, intestines, and lungs. The organs were placed in special containers, which were placed in the grave together with her embalmed body. They left only her heart in place, believing it to be the center of her being and intelligence, which she would need in her afterlife. Then her body was covered with salt and left to dry out for 40 days, after which it was stuffed with materials soaked in resins and oils to return it to its normal form. The slit was sewn up and her body wrapped in perfumed and oiled layers of linen with inserted talismans. At the request of our deceased queen, there was also a finely carved amulet from the wood of the tree goddess and a wooden ginkgo leaf. These should bring her luck and well-being in her next life. Before she could be placed in the coffin, a death mask was placed over her head. It was made of solid gold, with a face that did not resemble the face of our deceased queen. That didn't matter as long as it was symbolic of a queen's face. I had never before taken part in a royal funeral, so I had no comparison, but I regarded it as a beautifully crafted mask. The gold was polished to a high gloss. The oversized eyes and eyebrows were drawn with thick black lines, while the full lips were painted with a deep blue. But the special thing about it was the matte wooden headdress and the elongated collar, which contrasted strongly with the shiny, golden face. The ornate wooden collar extended downwards and beyond the breasts, which pierced through the wood like two balls, each crowned with a red sparkling stone. The wooden collar was divided into squares, each square representing a scene from the life of our deceased queen. I noticed that a picture of Annexie was present on every field, each time she was shown turning to the queen in one way or another. The deep affection our deceased queen had felt for Annexie, expressed here, was obvious. After the main embalmer secured the death mask, the mummy was placed in her rectangular coffin, which was also painted with divine scenes, hieroglyphics and patterns that were brought to life through rituals. We believed that whatever the gods would read in these writings would be repeatedly made to happen by means of magic. Annexie was at the end of her pregnancy, so I had Masuda and his helpers carry her to the grave in the desert cliffs, while I walked beside her. When the coffin arrived, a sandstorm threatened to develop, and our people were worried. Strange enough, it calmed down again with the beginning of the opening of the mouth ceremony, yet another sign that the gods behaved in odd ways. In a ceremonial performance, the priests opened the mouth of the mummy with a specially designed device. Thus, the senses and bodily functions of our deceased queen were freed so that they could function in the afterlife. Then the coffin, surrounded by food, furniture, and other necessities, was brought to the tomb. Before the tomb was sealed, Annexie and I went in to admire the grave goods and wall decorations. There were wooden figures made of the wood of the tree goddess, which resembled Annexie, and also the wall decorations represented her in the execution of various tasks. A smaller countersunk engraving, distinguished by its clarity, showed Annexie as queen and me by her side, surrounded by many descendants. A sunrise after the royal funeral, our first daughter was born. Normally, children were born in a special room on a birthing chair where statues of goddesses presented their divine powers in support. But Anexi had a different idea of birth. She knew that there was something much greater than the immediate existence of a woman. Her children were to be born in the current of our mighty river, which carried the knowledge of ancient wisdom and the original connection to life. Anexi had once said to me that she needed a god because she did not feel the divine power in her. I promised her then that I would always be at her side. This was the second time she asked me to awaken my spiritual powers to help her. Hence, my soul presence during labor and birth was invigorating. We both wanted the same gift for our children and met on a level of understanding that life and human purpose were comparable to the gods and spiritual beings of the universe. A previously unfelt relationship arose, which consisted of a deep feeling of trust in one's own body and inner being. So far, we had always believed unconditionally what the gods and spiritual beings told us, but a departure from traditional existential beliefs was born with the birth of our first child. Having previously ensouled the river with the spirit of my reproductive powers, I could now feel its essence flowing through my new family, endowing the latter with energy and a new consciousness. Our renewed temple became not only a place of worship, but also a place of food, shelter, and education. People could freely walk in and move around in the space between the outer walls and the main building. They talked, exchanged goods, and enjoyed the new services that had never been offered before. The main building was reserved for us and our personal staff, the royal officials, advisors, administrators, scribes, and the priests. My life as king at Anexi's side was exciting because every day offered something new. Anexi kept me amused and busy with her feminine demands, and there were also changes with me. My diet had not only increased in quantity, but also in quality. Therefore, I had gained a little weight, feeling healthier overall. I was convinced that even my phallus had grown larger and proudly ordered a larger loincloth, which was endorsed by Anexi with an appreciative smile and by Masuda with a raised fist as a sign of power. I almost completely stopped working physically. Occasionally I would serve Anexi a meal and perform other small tasks that a loving husband would do. Anexi had a completely different approach to royalhood. She considered herself a part of everything and refused to be treated in any other way than others. The morning dew, which continued to be collected daily, was now used for ritual washing for the mentally ill, giving them a chance to clear their confusion. Every day we went with our daughter to the banks of our mighty river and bathed in the cool, bubbling water. Masuda and 2 other soldiers accompanied us for protection, but discreetly turned away when we sank into our flirtatious game of hide and seek and throw and catch in the moving current. There was talk of a united Kemet under one pharaoh, with the temples becoming economic and administrative delegates of the pharaoh, and at their head a chieftain rather than a king or a queen. Although we would lose royal privileges, Anexi and I agreed to such a system. We believed that a monopoly would strengthen the whole country in times of chaos. Natural disasters, social unrest, and forces from neighboring countries who wanted to take over our fertile riverland were a constant threat. We needed a well-organized and better-equipped army of soldiers to defend our lands, and that could only be achieved with a powerful pharaoh at the center of it all, whose main task would be to maintain the justice of the universe, Ma'at, the divine order. A new settlement not far from our temple was in the process of being built at the border of the White Land and the Red Land, a place from where the new pharaoh would rule. Trade with Phoenicia for fine cedar wood was on the increase, and boats with cabins and oars were built for transporting goods between the White and the Red Land. Our temple was located near the point where our mighty river divided into many arms. The new boats stopped close by to deliver pottery and other things. The high quality of the pots and vases made in the White Land told us about our neighbors' sophisticated culture, which swept through the Red Land to eventually become one. Our farmers worked on a solution to avoid droughts and flash floods. Building reservoirs, dams, and irrigation channels became reality when architects and builders from the White Land presented detailed plans. Lots of manpower was needed, and thousands of peasants helped against payment in form of food and shelter. At the same time, this finally gave the anonymous people of the countryside a face. After having been ignored for centuries, their input became important in the advancement of a unified country. Their settlement closer to the temple, together with the arrival of people from other areas, transformed our temple into an ever-increasing geographical area, a powerhouse for economic trade, education, medicinal services, worshiping, work, and food for everyone. Anexi was pregnant with our 7th child and rested next to me while I watched my daughters play. Our firstborn Cameo had reached the age of 10 with creativity as one of her outstanding qualities. She was always active and busy, and her constant new ideas brought a lot of joy to the family. Cameo enjoyed long walks to the riverbank where she collected mud to sculpt dolls and animals, which she then dried in the hot sun. She had just finished a crocodile when the youngest, our 1-year-old Sada, tried to take it away from her. "I'll make you a new one," Cameo said patiently, and put the crocodile away to avoid further snatching attempts by her little sister. "What animal do you want?" "Fishy, fishy," babbled little Sada. Cameo got up to get more of the precious earth mass from her storage container. When she settled down again, Eboli, our 4th-born, sat down hastily next to Cameo. "I want a hippo," she demanded. "Well, if you are patient, I will make an animal for each of you," Cameo said with a loving smile. "I don't want an animal. I want to play ball with Rakal and Kahula," Naama shouted. She took her sisters by the hand and skipped away. Naama was 9 years old, blessed with the beauty of her mother, and very athletic. She loved to dance and exercise. Recently we had received a request from the pharaoh to have Naama dance for him. The pharaoh of our united country had moved into a nearby temple built for him and visited us regularly under the pretext of discussing political matters. I never understood why he kept trying to connect with my family. Most families would feel honored if their daughters could have danced for the pharaoh. But Anexi and I thought it was rude to be asked by him. As the pharaoh's first delegates, we enjoyed the highest rank in our society. That is why we had rejected. Since then there had been tension between him and my family. However, this tension did not only arise in this respect. There was also a deep split between his worldview and ours. We had been terribly wrong about him. At first, he had pretended to share our politics with us. But after his takeover, we realized that he had completely changed his mind about spiritual and economic progress. He also imagined that the gods had chosen him and that only he was responsible for the wealth and the healthy society. When the pharaoh and I met, we stared at each other with merciless and bone-chilling coldness. The bitter feeling of dislike for each other had a negative effect, not only on me, but on my whole family. I listened to my daughter's throwing game and was just dozing off when Masuda arrived with a message that the pharaoh sent his greetings to Anexi and asked how she was. "Why should he care?" I asked. "I don't know, Naguib. I am not in a position to question our pharaoh's message," Masuda said with a grin. "Then what are you grinning about, Masuda? Express yourself clearly," I demanded, angry that he was holding back something I should know. "Why are you so naive, Naguib?" Masuda asked. "Now tell me what's going on, or I'll chase you until you die in the dust," I yelled at him. "Ha ha ha! Let's see which of us will die first in the dust." Masuda blinked. I sulked. Then Masuda said what I had feared for a long time. "The pharaoh is in love with Anexi. Everyone knows that." A wave of anger came over me, and I jumped up. "Well, he can't have her!" I shouted. Anexi, who was lying next to me, woke up from her slumber. "He will never have me. I am yours and yours alone," she said sleepily. I asked her, "Have you ever noticed that he is in love with you?" "A woman knows when a man desires her," she muttered, and fell asleep again. Angry at the revelation, I went for a walk to calm myself down. On my return, Masuda was still waiting for an answer. "Tell him it's none of his business what state my wife is in." "Would it be wise to say that?" Masuda asked. "It could upset him." "Let him be angry!" I shouted. "He needs a clear message so that he can finally leave us alone." When Masuda left, a sudden thunder roared across the sky, a roar so loud it sent shivers down my spine, and my frightened daughters gathered around me in panic. Thunderstorms were unusual at this time of year. I looked down from the terrace of the temple and saw my people throwing their arms up to the sky in fear of Seth's curse. Did the god of chaos react to my hatred of the pharaoh? Was it perhaps even a warning? It had not rained for at least 3 full moons, but that day the clouds were dark and heavy, a sure sign of a storm coming soon. At that moment, Anexi attracted my attention. Her face was ashen, and her water had broken. "Prepare everything. We're going to the river," she said with a royal undertone. "No, Anexi, there's a storm coming. It would be unwise to go now," I said. "All my children were born in the river, and so will this one," she cried. "Masuda is gone. We will have no protection," I tried to convince her. "We have never been threatened by anyone before. Our people love us," she said. "That's right," I said, and gave up. As always, I succumbed to her wish. I hadn't learned to assert myself in the last 10 years either, because I still had the slave mentality in me. In this situation, however, I insisted that Anexi be taken to the river on a stretcher, which she gladly accepted. In the pouring rain, the river quickly swelled. When we arrived, the water threatened to burst the edge of its banks. I fervently hoped that this birth would be a quick one. A threatening smell of torn plants and churned, steamy ground penetrated me, and I felt something terrible was about to happen. A thick layer of fog glided over the current, which grew stronger with every blink of an eye. Anexi had reached the final stage of her contractions, and her heartbreaking groans cut through the changing landscape. In the urgency of her task, and completely unaware of her surroundings, she walked directly towards the flooded riverbank. "Anexi, don't go!" I shouted after her, and desperately threw both arms up. She turned around and looked at me without seeing me. The mighty power that drew her into the raging floods seemed to wipe away her sanity. Before she disappeared into the fog, I saw her silhouette merge with a blurry essence that reminded me of a poisonous spirit. "Anexi, wait up!" I tried to follow her, but something held me back. A sudden flutter of wings, a drizzle, a gust of wind, a mysterious noise from the swamp. Everything around me felt unreal and strange. I looked down and saw my feet stuck in a swirling mass of muddy quicksand. Amazed, I followed the flow of the creek. Then I froze in the uncompromising stare of a giant river crocodile. It lay a little off the beaten track in a puddle of murky water and could hardly be seen due to its merging color with the surrounding nature. Its carnivorous look numbed me, and my urge to follow Anexi immediately disappeared, for I knew that the slightest sideways movement would cause the animal to jump in my direction to grab me. Not that I could move. The muddy sand sucked me deeper and deeper into the wandering earth, which now completely surrounded me. At that moment it became clear to me that I was not only at the mercy of this animal, but that I had no chance to remove myself from it. To escape the relentless gaze of this predator, I closed my eyes, which inadvertently took me back to the past. Tears ran down my cheeks as scenes from my life went through my mind. My happy childhood on the farm, the silver cup that my father gave me on his deathbed, the morning dew collection for the bath of our deceased queen, the bony hands of my old brutal master, and my near death in the dungeon. But when I remembered Anexi's beautiful face and our lush lovemaking, the birth of our children, and the happy life we had in the temple, warmth and peace flooded my raging heart. Anexi, my queen, who at that time was in great danger of being swallowed by the river whilst giving birth to our 7th child. Anexi, with whom I had to urgently stand by at this moment. I breathed deeply and felt a humid, heavy air fill my lungs with an immense force. Then I looked up at the sky and shouted with all my heart, Anexi, where are you? The pitch of my voice startled me. It penetrated the fields, the bush, and the fog. It drowned the call of the marsh bird, the rumbling of the thunder, and the rustle of the rain. I opened my eyes and saw the crocodile's wavy trail disappear into the nearby bush, with its protruding tail reminding me of its threatening presence. My shrill voice seemed to have distracted the animal from its hunting instinct. Somehow relieved by what had just happened, I tried to move, without success. With vigilant senses, I let the elements of nature wash over me, to the moment I saw someone approaching me in the corner of my eye. "What in the world has happened?" Masuda shouted to me, soaked by the rain and fighting his way through the storm. He looked very worried. "Anexi has disappeared," I managed to say. Without delay, he ordered his men to search the riverbank. Then he threw a rope around me and tied it to a nearby tree trunk. Slowly, he pulled me out of the mud. Finally, I was free to run after Anexi. 1,000 questions went through my mind. Why didn't she wait for me when I called her? Why didn't she come back to me? Had she already given birth to our baby? Where could she have gone? In the panic of a higher state of consciousness, I knew that she was still alive and that there was a new life of which I was the giver. We searched day and night, but Anexi was nowhere to be found. In complete bewilderment, I went back to the temple. My head wobbled, my hands trembled, and my legs swayed. Cameo and Naama were waiting for me at the temple entrance. They saw me coming from afar and knew something terrible had happened. When I looked into their weeping faces, the grief was so great that I could not bear it, and I collapsed before them. They brought me in, but I was inconsolable. Guilt ate me from the inside, the worry made me vomit, and the urgency to find Anexi gave me insomnia, despite my total exhaustion. My condition worsened even more when Masuda told me that a farmer had seen Pharaoh's soldiers take Anexi with them on the riverbank. Anexi was imprisoned, and the Pharaoh had defeated me, because he knew that the loss would destroy me. A spark of hope remained within me, though, as the Pharaoh was not aware of my extraordinary spiritual strength, on which I then began to rely to win back Anexi and my new child. In the middle of the night, I got up and went to the tree goddess. I wanted to find comfort and inspiration in the statues that resembled Anexi so much, and that once made me feel wonderful. It did not surprise me that the tree goddess was in bad shape. Her hanging leaves and thinned crown were a warning from the heavens for Anexi's suffering. As I walked around the beautiful statues and lingered with everyone, I felt Anexi's touch, smelled her scent, heard the lovely sound of her voice, and tasted the sweetness of her skin. I drowned in the pain of losing her. At that time, my physical self was so weak that the feeling for it had almost disappeared. I had previously trained my body through pain, suffering, and torture, and knew that at some point I could endure my painful condition without disturbing my mind too much. Once this state was reached, my spiritual nature would take over and cause a direct soul impression. I could only see my true soul when I went into myself and reached a psychic state. It was similar to Masuda's strong thought that influenced me so much by telepathy that it appeared as an image in my soul. Only this time, the source of this power would come from my weakened state, not from Masuda's influence. So I sat down, looked up at the bright moon, and meditated. Revelation and intuition would show me the way to save Anexi and my child from the temple of the Pharaoh. I was completely unaware of time, but when Masuda touched my shoulder, the larvae of the scarabs I had noticed before my meditation had eaten most of the manure near me. I saw the dung beetle as a symbol of the celestial cycle as performed by our sun god Ra. As Ra rolled across the sky every day, transforming bodies and souls, so too did these dung beetles undergo a complete transformation. The life cycle included the egg, the larva, the pupa, and finally the adult beetle. On this day, I made the scarab my lucky charm, for it also stood for rebirth, the rebirth I had lived through in the recent past, as I had seen glimpses of what was to come.
Naguib, wake up!
I can't understand what you're saying, I slurred. I haven't said anything, except that you should wake up, Masuda said. I stretched out and slowly stood up with stiff limbs, but a completely clear head. I have good news and bad news, he said. Give me the bad news first, I demanded. He breathed in deeply, obviously knowing this would upset me deeply. The pharaoh made Anexi his wife. She is now known as the Great Royal Wife. My heart missed a beat, my stomach cramped, and my guts knotted. Within the shortest time, a lump formed in my throat, starting from the size of a small egg that turned into a huge ball. I wheezed and became dizzy. The irascibleness grabbed me with such force that I attacked Masuda wildly. Before you go on, listen to the good news, he said calmly and pushed me away without any difficulty. Speak, I screamed. We have heard through loopholes that the Great Royal Wife wishes her daily bathtub filled with morning dew. We have also heard that she demands to collect the first drops herself, according to tradition, and as her grandmother, our deceased queen, did. I sank to my knees and threw up my arms. Anexi, my queen of love, you are calling for me. Naguib, calm down. We need a plan. Yes, I said, bursting with agitation. As soon as we have her and the child back, we must flee. Otherwise Pharaoh will kill us all. How so, Naguib? Masuda asked. During my meditation I saw sand, rocky landscapes, a caravan, and an oasis. The desert will protect you from the Pharaoh's soldiers, Masuda said confidently. We'll all have to go, I said. None of our temple dwellers or friends will be safe under the Pharaoh when we take Anexi and my 7th daughter. Masuda took a step back. This would affect him and his family greatly. But Masuda was loyal, a friend, and always ready to adapt. He thought briefly before he spoke again. My wife Rania is friends with the wife of the Pharaoh's guard. She is to find out when Anexi's symbolic dew collection will happen. Then we'll strike. He took his sword out of its sheath and let his finger glide slowly and deliberately over the sharp edge of the polished obsidian sword head. Let's try not to kill anyone, I said with a chill in my voice. How else do you plan to free Anexi and baby from the claws of the guards? Masuda asked. We'll stun the guards with a strong narcotic brew, I said. Where will you get it from? Masuda asked. I'll have it brewed from figs. But how will you get the Pharaoh's soldiers to drink it? Masuda asked. I hadn't thought of this, and admitted, I don't know. I have an idea, Masuda said, and kept quiet, which annoyed me. Will you tell me? I asked. They'll all get a slap in the head first. When they wake up with a headache, we'll offer it as medicine. An excellent idea, Masuda. Finally, I could smile again. There was a break. Masuda was lost in thought. How do we get away from here without being discovered? He asked. There is a secret underground passage leading from the central chamber of the temple directly to the river bank. There, our boats have to be loaded and ready to go. We'll drift downstream with the current and leave the boats under the huge old fig tree, which marks the beginning of the great water. Then we'll need donkeys with baskets and seats to carry us through the desert to the oasis where the sun sets beyond the horizon. We need supplies, Masuda said. We need wheat and barley seed so we can start a new settlement, I said. How many of us will go? We need to talk to all our friends. They should all come with us to save their lives. The most important thing is to find a trustworthy guide who will lead us safely through the desert, Masuda said thoughtfully. Find one, Masuda, I said, and patted him encouragingly on the shoulder. I went on to the wine chamber of my temple. Our master brewer, Ebony, brewed wine and beer for many temples of the land. The wine was delivered in particularly large quantities to the new Pharaoh temple. Ebony had recently become one of the busiest men in the area. He looked up surprised when he saw me coming in. What can I do for you, my king? How many times do I have to say it, Ebony? You shall not call me my king. My parents did not give me a name in vain. Forgive me, Naguib. Old habits cannot be changed so quickly. I went to one of the fermentation tanks and said, I'll show you how to distill high-proof alcohol from the fig mash you have in there. Is my wine too weak for the Pharaoh? Ebony asked. No, I replied. Before he could ask any more, I said, Let's use that kettle over there, that hose and that container for the alcohol. Together, we lifted the kettle onto the fireplace. "What is the secret behind it?" Ebony asked. "There is no secret. I have the wisdom of my grandfather, who learned it from a stranger from the East." Ebony looked at me confused. I knew his question was meant differently, but pretended I hadn't noticed. "Look," Ebony said, "I've tried it before. This homemade equipment works better." Abruptly, he pulled a big blanket off something that looked like a perfect distillation device. This time it was my turn to be amazed. "That's exactly what I'm looking for!" I shouted enthusiastically. Ebony was happy to have saved my day and bowed slightly. "How much do you need?" he asked. 3 of these amphorae, I said, pointing to some unused vessels on the shelf. "I will have filled them with high-proof alcohol after 4 sunrises," Ebony confirmed and turned away to begin his work. The next time I saw Masuda, he was covered in dust and mud. The message he had was too important to delay for the sake of looking clean. My wife, Rania, found out that Pharaoh would soon travel his lands. Anexi plans to use the first sunlight 3 mornings after his departure to undertake the symbolic dew collection with your new daughter. Excitement flooded through me. I would see my beloved wife again, take her in my arms, and feel the vibration of her inner essence. I would hold my 7th daughter, my child, for whom I felt reverence and gratitude that the gods had given her birth and a place in the universe. "We'll have to wait for Pharaoh and his soldiers to leave before we can prepare the boats and organize the donkeys," I urged. "Otherwise, we could attract the attention of those who are not to know about our plan." "Yes, meanwhile I have checked out the tunnel," Masuda announced. "We've cleared away roots and reinforced the walls. It is now safe to lead many people through it." "Get the supplies ready, Masuda," I instructed. "It will be a long journey." After the departure of the pharaoh, I informed the temple inhabitants and my friends about our plan, and also about their risk of being captured and killed if they decided to stay behind. I asked for absolute confidentiality, and they promised me their loyalty. We had always treated them well, and our people had loved Anexi as their queen of the people, with me at her side. Yet my people looked both worried and excited. Their future and that of their families depended on the successful completion of this mission. They were literally on call to flee through the tunnel as soon as Anexi and my child were in safe hands. The loving support that my children and friends gave me in the following days, despite the uncertainty, calmed my burning heart for Anexi and my 7th daughter, whom I called Kaione, the mythical daughter of the river. The statue of our temple goddess was dismantled and packed for the journey. The high priest would not leave without her, for he needed her to build a new temple at our destination. Seeds of various crops and supplies were prepared and packed under the strictest secrecy. The temple boats anchored ready to go at the place where the underground tunnel ended. Pack donkeys and a pair each of goats, pigs, sheep, and geese were to be brought upon our arrival to the large old fig tree, which stood proudly and majestically downstream at the beginning of the great water. On the 3rd morning after Pharaoh's departure, long before the sun god Ra had sent his first rays to our precious earth, I left my temple to arrive at the meeting point in time. It was an unspoken understanding among all involved that this meeting was to take place in the crown of the tree goddess. Masuda and his men came equipped with wooden clubs to knock down Anexi's guards. A priest-doctor, equipped with amulets and a wand, arrived with a decorated medicine bottle filled with the narcotic brew, a specialty of Ebony. When we heard distant voices, my heart almost exploded with expectation. Being nervous about something was one thing, but mastering a life-changing event that affected so many others was another. I stood hidden behind the tree trunk when Anexi's guards divided the crown to grant her entry for the symbolic dew collection. Her posture was slightly bent, which I immediately attributed to her suffering. My heart sank and I stiffened. A single ray of morning sunlight clutching Anexi's body disintegrated into a shower of sparks, which then went out. Blinded by the bright light accents, we stood rooted in absolute darkness. Like so many times before, Anexi's presence impacted on me strongly. I could smell her like flowers and taste her like honey. But something fundamental was missing. "Where is our child?" I asked into the dark silence. At that moment, Masuda and his soldiers stormed in and hit each of the guards on the head. They collapsed like paper soldiers, and the threat ended abruptly. Anexi fell into my arms and cried bitterly. Sobbing, she told me that Kione was in the care of the wet care woman. The pharaoh had forbidden the wet nurse to let Anexi go with the baby. "This is how he keeps her from fleeing," Masuda said. "That's correct. We will not go without my 7th daughter," I said bitterly, holding Anexi close to me. Masuda straightened. "I'll get her." "How?" Anexi and I asked simultaneously. "Trust the gods," Masuda said. While we stood there perplexed and helpless, one of the pharaoh's guards moaned. He sat up slowly and held his head. "Drink this," the priest doctor instructed, and held the bottle to his mouth. The guard was confused. "It'll make your headache better." The priest doctor nodded encouragingly. The man took a generous sip, drew a face, and drank more. We watched his eyes roll before he collapsed on the ground again. The second guard was more skeptical, but when the priest doctor sang magic spells and waved his wand around him, he finished the bottle, which knocked him out too. Masuda left to claim our daughter. As Anexi clung to me, I could feel that she was deeply shaken. The kidnapping had left a deep wound in us, and we realized how vulnerable we were in the hands of this powerful man who was a god to many. Our plan to flee became even more urgent. As the sun went down that day, we were ready to go, and I looked out for Masuda desperately from the terrace of the temple. In the distance, I saw him approaching with a bundle in his arms, followed by a man and a woman who also carried a bundle. It dawned on me what he had done, and when he finally arrived with Kione in his arms and the couple with their own child, he told me how he had got Kione back. Masuda had gone straight to the wet nurse's house. There, he had knocked down the 2 guards who were watching the door with a violent blow. The husband and his own infant had been in the house. Masuda had torn the child out of the husband's hands and threatened him that if he ever wanted to see it alive again, he would have to give him Kione immediately. The man had run away in total shock and had returned with his wife and Kione after a short time. The couple asked him if they could come with him, fearing that the pharaoh would kill them on his return. Masuda agreed. We drifted slowly with the current against the wind coming from the great water, followed by a long row of crowded boats. The final preparations had been hectic and frightening for many, as no one had ever dared to embark on such an uncertain journey. My 6 daughters sat in front of me with Anexi and Kione at their side. An eerie silence came upon us. Only the soft ripple of the water on the riverbank could be heard. While I stood at the back with the rudder, trying to keep a straight course, Anexi often turned to me. Slowly her eyes began to shine again, her radiant brilliance, which so often had made my phallus rise before, and which again at that moment made me appreciate my earthly existence. I looked down into the silent, flowing mass of earthly water. The river had given me comfort many times in my life, in addition to its gift of blessing my healthy children with its divine power. Unlike others, I saw no danger in its hidden depths, and this time our mighty river proved once again to be of help to get us away from the source of an impending disaster. From a distance we saw the outline of the big old fig tree. Its crown stretched over a huge area. As we approached, we noticed that aerial roots were growing down from the branches. Some of these roots had grown into the ground and formed solid supports for the heavy branches. What had the god of trees had in mind when he created this massive wooden vegetation that looked like several trees? I firmly believed that the next world was a continuation of this one. For this tree it meant that the old trunks were slowly decomposed, while new trunks were continuously formed to pass into the next world without leaving this or the next world in the physical state. We gathered with our boats at the level of the fig tree. Expectantly we looked into the dark crown. Slowly gray shadows rose out of the darkness, which after a while revealed themselves to be donkeys. They moved slowly between the trunks, chewing barley straw and drinking water. Some were laden with baskets and seats, others had two-wheeled carts behind them, attached to their bodies with cords. A man came down to the shore and waved at me. I suspected that he was our guide to lead us through the desert. He looked very friendly and shouted something to me that I didn't understand. I shrugged my shoulders, after which he shouted something else to me that I did not understand either. Anexi turned to me. He speaks with words we cannot understand. Where did Masuda get this contact from, I wonder? I said quietly to myself. Perhaps he comes from the land of spirits, Chehenu, Anexi replied. I got a little queasy. I had never been friends with a person who did not speak my language. Should I entrust my life and the life of my family to this alien man? Wherever he comes from, I hope he will be able to show us the right way, I said. Look, father, there he stands again, called little Eboli excitedly, and pointed to another man who stepped a little further out of the crown. In fact, he was the double of the first man. I swallowed. Heaven and earth. Why heaven and earth? Asked Ra'akel, Eboli's bigger sister. Because they complement each other, meaning that the two complete each other and form a whole, just as heaven and earth form the universe, I explained. Who is heaven and who is earth? Asked the always silent Kahula after a long reflection. We looked at her in surprise, as we hardly knew her voice, but what was just said seemed to have fascinated her. That's what we'll find out when we get to know them, Anexi answered. I watched from a distance as Masuda steered his boat to the bank of the river, climbed out, and greeted the twins as if they were old acquaintances. Was there a connection between them? Masuda was older than my deceased parents. He had surprised me with revelations about Anexi's family background before, and also with his knowledge about Adolfo's hatred for our deceased queen. Maybe this was another wisdom from him I didn't know about. I had long since realized that Masuda was not an ordinary soldier. Deep down, he seemed to know more than he pretended. Slowly I maneuvered our boat towards the group of men and climbed out. Masuda gesticulated with hands and feet to make himself understood, while the twins nodded in unison. What are they saying? I asked. They say they know a safe way across the desert to an oasis in their country, Chehenu, Masuda translated. How do you know these people? I asked. Masuda turned around and looked at me. You have never asked me about my past, Naguib. These men could be distant relatives of mine. How can that be? I asked in amazement. My ancestors were desert nomads. There was a high incidence of twins in my bloodline. The twins looked at me smilingly, while they were still nodding. How did you contact them? I asked. Through my friend Ebony, the master brewer. He is also one of us. Ebony joined the group with his family. He seemed very happy to have rediscovered his distant relatives. As I stood there amazed, Anexi stepped out to greet the twins. One after the other, my daughters did exactly like their mother did. Kione, our youngest, sitting on Anexi's arm, grabbed the beard of one of the twins and started playing with it. We laughed. The men radiated warmth and gentleness, and suddenly they were no longer strangers anymore. Their faces were marked with deep wrinkles, which was probably due to a life under the desert sun. Their lean bodies were wrapped in layers of fabric I did not know, their heads covered with something resembling a simplified headdress, and their feet wrapped in animal skins. One of them made us understand that we should start the journey in the safety of darkness, so that at dawn we would have reached the big rock that marked the transition from the settlement area to the desert. When all the boats were cleared out and everyone was on land, I estimated that at least twice as many families as the fingers on my hands had come with us. Because they had also brought their closest relatives and friends with them, the caravan of people, donkeys, animals, and carts stretched as far as my eyes could reach from my position at the beginning. Slowly the caravan set in motion. The stars shone brightly down on us from a pitch-black night sky, and the moon seemed to be watching our every move. The bigger children fell silent in the face of the overwhelming situation, while the smaller ones fell asleep in their baskets as soon as the wheels of their carts started to turn. While I was in high spirits, I saw many of the adults crying. Masuda was inconsolable, and tears ran down his face. I had never seen him like this, and asked his wife Rania if there was anything I could do. He remembers his childhood when his family roamed the desert for grassland to feed their animals, she explained. Why did they stop doing that? I asked, puzzled by this sudden insight into Masuda's past. His parents were both killed by a desert lion. He watched as the pack tore them both to pieces and devoured them, Masuda's wife told. He was lucky that the lions didn't turn on him, I murmured, and immediately regretted it. Of luck he cannot speak. The lions were full, Rania exclaimed. My stomach turned around. He carried it with him all those years without giving me even a hint of it, I said. He refuses to talk about it with anyone, not even with me. What happened to him then? I asked. He was found half dead by nomads who brought him to our mighty river. There he was taken in by our deceased queen and raised as a soldier, Rania explained. I'm sorry I never knew anything about it. That wouldn't have made any difference, Naguib. He hates to be pitied. Rania turned to Masuda, who had calmed down a bit, and said, Since then, he believes Seth rules the desert. I thought while my donkey slowly trotted after the one in front of him. Many of us believe that Seth rules the desert. They let their faith rule their lives, I said. But sometimes we have to let the gods and spirits go their own way so that we can concentrate on our own body and inner being. What are you saying, Naguib? Rania asked. Remember, Rania, it was the change that annexi as your queen seek before the pharaoh took power. What I say is that you should trust yourself before you seek an answer from the gods and spirits. But the gods and spirits are the highest order, Rania said angrily. I didn't give up, for I had to get rid of my thoughts. Not that I wanted to convince Rania, but now that we were on the way to a new life, everything was different from before. What about man's earthly life? Why are we here? The gods and spirits have given us a purpose. Only through our purpose can we measure ourselves against them. I don't understand this. Rania seemed very confused. I think, Rania, we will experience it ourselves on our journey, I said. How? The journey through the desert will give us the opportunity to search for the truth in us. For in every human being there is the spark of divinity, the Osiris. In order to make ourselves expand this spark and bring it to full maturity, we must speak to it inwardly in the language of the gods. But how would we perceive this language? She asked. Through the cosmos, through feeling, through receiving messages from the wind, the stars, and the moon, and through the birth of our children. This is the language of nature, the language of the universe, the language of the gods. The donkeys trotted on with their silent riders. I had never thought much of myself, but that night I knew I had matured. It had taken all these years to realize that I could live like an Osiris. I was on my way to a new life under the sparkling stars and offered freedom and opportunity to my 7 daughters. 7. The number of virtues of the goddess Ma'at to reach human perfection. Truth, justice, balance, order, compassion, harmony, and mutuality. With the birth of our 7th child, my vocation to contribute to the earthly and spiritual world was anchored. I had used my powers on earth to act according to the ideas of the spiritual powers. My 7 daughters offered the womb to future generations who would pass on the Osiris that had grown within me. And I would be able to be united with these powers after death because I had worked for them. But did that make me perfect? At dawn, we reached the big rock that marked the entrance to the desert. Ebony translated me a message from heaven and earth that it would be best to move on so we'd gain a safe distance from the settlement. When our sun god stood steeply in the sky above us, we sat down to rest in the shade of a lonely tree. Annexi was exhausted, and she had to lie down while I took care of our smaller children. This was the first time I held Keone in my arms. She was gorgeous. Happily, she kicked her legs and gave away smiling, babbling noises. We played with her for a while. It felt special to have her, and we thanked the gods for allowing her and Anexi to get out of the claws of the hated Pharaoh. Heaven and earth joined us. Their warm compassion made us embrace them. One of them, whom we recognized as Heaven, pointed to the firmament and explained something. Ebony translated that it would be easiest to move at night, because then Heaven could orient himself by the stars. I agreed. At night it was cool. The children slept, and the darkness protected us from attackers. It was going to be an exhausting journey, but I was full of newfound energy as I had my beloved family around me. I was looking forward to a new beginning in the oasis. Days and nights passed in the timeless rhythm of the constant moving and resting. The desert seemed a lifeless landscape in which the horizon dissolved in all directions in the watery waves of a distant image. Early in the morning, as soon as the rays of the sun god gently touched our land, Earth led us to protected places between long dunes that had formed parallel to the prevailing winds. We rested in the shade of temporary shelter made up of sticks and animal skins. Earth showed us the birds of the desert and explained how they could be of use to us. We observed flocks of small migratory birds flying directly over us, which used oases and waterholes as stopovers. Following these birds meant survival. Large birds of prey hovering in the air used hot thermals to gain height and then glided down to spot their prey and catch it in a nosedive. It was worthwhile to visit these places, because there one would find small, underground living mammals. These were said to be very tasty. From time to time, Earth led us to hidden waterholes, of which only he and the animals of the desert knew. In the area surrounding these locations, we found broken ostrich eggshells and bones of big animals like giraffes and elephants that once must have lived there in a savanna landscape, a landscape that had offered enough water and food but had since been dried out over an unimaginable period of time. To everyone's astonishment, we also found scattered whale bones and mussels in the sand. From their presence, we concluded that the desert must have once been covered by the Great Water. In deep thought, I became aware that the desert had gone through epochs of fundamental change just like mankind had, although the desert spoke of events that went far beyond our temporal minds. I let the sand slowly trickle through my hands. Every grain of sand was a relic of incredible importance. Why had our god Seth chosen the desert as a place of chaos? Confused, I looked over to my beloved wife. She smiled at me, and the light of our love flooded me. The light that built me up again and again. Our love that had given life to our 7 daughters. The love that would travel in my soul into the future. Soon, the exhaustion of our elders and children was so great that we decided to take a longer break at the next waterhole. As we approached it, the donkeys changed from a slow step into a trot and began to bray. The other animals also got excited. The pigs grunted, the geese chattered, and the goats and sheep bleated. Our young children joined the animal vocals, and soon the combined singing sounded like a concert of joy. The adults exchanged glances smilingly. We were in urgent need of water and looking forward to wash and drink plenty of it. The water hole proclaimed by Earth turned out to be a small, freshwater lake, protected by a few palm trees scattered around it. The tiny oasis lay between sand dunes in a rocky depression. Spring water flowed in a trickle from an overhanging rock, which made it all seem paradisiacal. We threw ourselves into the water while the animals stood on the shore and drank. Soon we discovered that we were not the only visitors. Earth found traces of a pack of desert lions leading in and out of the water. I blinked over to Masuda. "I still have a score to settle with these beasts," he said, pulling his sword out of its sheath. Ebony patted Masuda on the shoulder. "We'll do it together, my friend." Another 3 men from our group joined them. They had made sure to be well protected for the trip. Swinging catapults, clubs, and swords with copper blades were revealed. Heaven and earth watched from a distance. They came closer, and by their demeanor we knew they had an important message to tell. Ebony translated, "Let us not forget that nature is within us. As a sublime form of divine appearance, it is our ambition to respect all living things. If the lions don't attack us, we have no reason to kill them." Masuda looked down disappointedly. I felt that what they had just said was a tough challenge for him. After all, as a soldier, he had always tried to protect the temple and eliminate any danger immediately. Apart from that, hatred seemed to consume him, and all he wanted was to take revenge on the lions for his parents. "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," he said, thrusting his sword powerfully into the ground. "An eye for an eye, and the whole world will go blind," Heaven replied gently. We glanced at him in awe. He spoke our language. "We know what happened to your parents, Masuda," he continued. "Try to see it this way. Hatred is the coward's revenge. No revenge is also revenge, for you show your strength." We set up camp, and Masuda and the men kept watch day and night, but no lion appeared. It happened just as we were leaving the camp. The donkeys with riders trotted slowly in front of the animals with the supply carts. Suddenly we heard a scream. It was not human. Masuda seemed to know immediately what was going on. He jumped down from his animal and ran with his sword drawn towards the end of the caravan. We turned around in shock and saw a bleeding donkey lying on the ground. A huge lion had settled leisurely over it and tore the donkey's flesh from its body in shreds, while the donkey was still alive and kicking into the air with its last remaining strength. I watched from afar as Masuda raised his spear as he approached the gruesome scene. The lion immediately felt threatened and tried to intimidate Masuda with a gut-wrenching roar. Masuda, however, used this as his chance. He violently stabbed his spear into the lion's throat. A gurgling sound so terrible that the cold sweat ran down my back filled the air. When Masuda forcibly pulled his spear out of the animal, the blood splashed from the lion's throat like a fountain. Then he stabbed it again, this time into the heart, then into the eye, then again into the heart. The lion was finally dead, and Masuda gasped. Covered in blood, he stood up, raised his sword, and screamed with all his heart. It sounded like the victorious cry of a winner, and at the same time the liberating cry of a sufferer. Finally, he had done the deed that would free him from his overshadowing past. Heaven and earth rejected Masuda's request to cut up the donkey and use its flesh as food. Our supply of dried meat was coming to an end, and the rations were getting smaller every day. But no, they said, this animal was sacred and could not be eaten by humans. The gods, once threatened by giants, had hidden under the guise of animals, so this one had to be treated with great respect. It would be nobler to suffer hunger than to jeopardize the sacredness of these animals. Since we were now missing one animal, the remaining cart had to be pulled by another. Amazed, I watched as Ebony skillfully transferred the harness from the dead donkey to his and attached the wagon to it. He didn't seem to mind going on foot either. It was all our endeavor to get to our destination as quickly as possible, and a sacrifice like this was a matter of course. Despite everything, the thought didn't let go of me when and where he had learned to put a donkey in front of a cart. After all, I only knew him as the master brewer of my former temple. When I asked him about it, he said that this ability was flowing in the blood of the nomads. After weeks of strain, exhaustion, constant safety risks such as snakes and wild animals, some injuries, and fear of the unknown, we finally arrived at the oasis in Tiahenu. Deeply relieved, we camped at the edge of the massive depression, which was dotted with springs, palm trees, and small freshwater lakes. The sound of splashing water and rushing, shadow-casting palm fronds let our dulled senses blossom again. Anexi and I went up a rocky hill to look at our future home environment. Obviously, other people had already rested in some places before us, because there were some shreds of animal skins torn by wind and sun hanging from the branches of isolated bushes. Otherwise, there were no signs of permanent settlement, which made us breathe a sigh of relief. We held each other tightly as Kahula snuggled up to our legs. She had not said a word during the whole trip, nor had she complained once. In stark contrast to others, young or old, she seemed to have enjoyed the journey. At night, as we had walked, she had stayed near heaven to let him explain the stars to her. Judging by her behavior in that moment, she had something on her mind. Before she began, she breathed in deeply. Heaven and earth have read the magic of the signs. They know how to unite the soul of the caravan with that of the desert. They also know how to bring the steps of the caravan together with the language of the desert so that it can reach its destiny. Anexi and I looked at each other in astonishment. Kahula had never spoken such a long sentence before, not to mention one so deeply considered and spoken from her own mind. "You observed that well, my child," I said. My daughter continued, "I was deeply impressed by the wisdom of our desert leaders. I would like to be taught by them." Anexi swallowed. "That would mean you had to go with them." "That's what I wish for," Kahula said, looking up at us with conviction. Heaven came to us and bowed slightly. "Forgive me, but I overheard the conversation. I have long noticed that the child has unique talents that speak of extreme profundity. If you allow it, we would like to be her teachers. Let us first settle down and recover. Then we'll talk about it again," I decided. Kahula looked at us, examining. What she saw was her shocked parents facing a difficult decision. Kahula was still a child, but during the journey she seemed to have discovered her passion, her truth. Her calm mind produced immense empathy with a feel for the language of nature, the universe, and the gods. Kahula had been able to awaken the divine spark that had previously rested within her. Excited voices woke us up the next morning. It was before dawn when Heaven stuck his head in our makeshift shelter and asked us to come outside. Kahula jumped excitedly off her mat. She seemed to be the only one of us who knew what was going on. Heaven led us to the top of the rocky hill and threw his arms against the eastern horizon. "There!" he exclaimed. "Soon our life-giving star will appear, the star of Horus, the divine child of Isis and Osiris." We watched as the shimmering beyond the horizon increased. Then, as the bright star flashed in the midst of a wave of light so bright that our eyes filled with tears. Horus, the divine child, avenged himself for Osiris, defeated evil and killed Seth, Heaven explained. The rise of Horus is a divine sign given by the stars to settle right here. Seth no longer rules this part of the desert. We looked at the star that seemed to be smiling at us in all its brilliance. Pictures of my childhood rose in me, and I remembered how the slave farmers had waited every year eagerly for the star, which appeared on the horizon after 70 days in the darkness. For them it had been like a resurrection, for they combined the rise of this holy star with the swelling of our mighty river, which watered their fields. Here, in the desert, far away from the river, the star's ascent meant the destruction of the evil desert god. I fervently hoped that Heaven was right, and Seth was defeated forever in this part of the desert, so that we could build our new home in peace and harmony. Kahula ripped me from my thoughts. "There it is!" She pointed to a row of 3 stars, one of which was slightly offset. "It is Osiris looking down on us." "What do you think he sees?" I asked. "He's telling us something," Kahula answered. "What is he telling us, Kahula?" Anexi asked. "To let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth." We looked at each other in amazement. The child was indeed able to understand the language of the gods. "The message has a deep meaning and applies to us," Anexi said thoughtfully. "Only through caring and helping each other can our love for one another be expressed. This resolution should help us to start afresh." Kahula continued, "We should also test and judge in truth, not fool each other, but do what we have to do courageously and trustingly." I ended the conversation with my deeply felt and self-acquired wisdom. And we should honor the dignity of the Osiris who lives within us, for from him alone comes the power of love. His strength will make our soul perfect and immortal. We knew that the celestial event had a special meaning, and we all formed a human chain that surrounded our camp at the edge of the oasis. Then we lifted our joined hands towards the Star of Horus. I was not the only one profoundly touched by this heartfelt ceremony, a beautiful testament to belonging and love that stirred the soul and left an enduring imprint on all of us. This marks the end of Naguib's story. The sequel is in conceptual planning. Until then, keep your nose in the wind and your eyes along the horizon.